Today's story is one that I told several years ago back on YouTube, but during my 2024 live tour, I brought this one back out and gave it a complete overhaul and ended up telling it live. In the fall of 1986, Frank Bowen, along with his two daughters, Tina, who was 15, and Karen, who was 9, they experienced just a terrible loss. So Frank's wife and the girl's mother suddenly passed away from cancer. And so that in and of itself was obviously tragic and terrible, but what made it even worse is that, she had been a working mom, and her income was a vital part of just making ends meet in the Bowen household. And so as soon as she passed away, as much as Frank just wanted to be there for his girls to help them grieve the loss of their mother, he really couldn't. He started immediately having to pick up all these late night shifts at his job, again, just to make sure financially the family was whole. And so it's like within days of the mother passing away, Frank is out late at work, and these two poor girls are just stuck at home by themselves, just totally grief-stricken and alone. And so in October of that year, on one of those nights where Tina and Karen were home alone and their dad was out working late, these girls, you gotta remember, they desperately miss their mother. All they want is to just have one more interaction with her. They can't believe that she's gone. They were so close with her. It's like their whole lives have been turned upside down. And so on this night that they're home alone, putting themselves to bed, they start talking about how, man, I just wish there was just a way to communicate with mom. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute, maybe there is a way to do that. So the girls owned a Ouija board, and a Ouija board is basically a way people believe they can speak to the dead. It looks sort of like a game board. It's got letters and numbers on it, and it's got a yes and a no on there. And there's this thing called a planchette, which is basically like this little free-floating dial, almost like a pointer, that you can place on the board. And people that use the Ouija board will place their fingertips right on the edge of the planchette. And they will literally just say things like, if there are spirits in the room with me right now, give me a sign. And in theory, if there are, the spirits will move the planchette around so that people have their fingertips on it, but they're not controlling it. And it will move around the board and land on yes or no, or spell things out or give numbers. It's just a way people believe they can speak to the dead. And so Karen and Tina are like, why don't we get our Ouija board out and have a seance? Let's try to communicate with mom and see if she manipulates the board and gives us a sign that she's here with us. And so Tina and Karen, they get their Ouija board. They go down into the basement of their house, they lay it out, and they put their fingers on the planchette. And after a minute, one of the girls is like, hey, Mom, are you here with us right now? And they have their fingers on the planchette, but nothing happens. So again, the girls kind of wait a minute, and they try again. Mom, if you're here with us right now, please, anything, just move it even a little bit. Show us you're here with us right now. Nothing happens. And so over and over and over again for over an hour, the girls just sit there asking every combination of question they can possibly think of to try to elicit a response from their mother, who they so want to believe is like with them right now, sort of looking out for them. But no matter how earnestly and passionately they asked these questions, the planchette never moved. So the seance didn't work. And so the girls, it's not clear if they literally believed they were actually going to get a reaction from their mom. But, this was pretty disappointing. It was like another reminder that, mom really is gone. And so they packed up their Ouija board, very frustrated, and they went upstairs to their respective bedrooms on the second floor of the house. They climb into bed and they try to go to sleep. So their father is still out at work. He won't be home for some time. And the girls know this. They know that they are home alone until they fall asleep. And so they're laying in their bedrooms. It's totally dark. It's quiet. And as they're laying there, the girls begin to hear a tapping sound coming from somewhere in their house. Now, it was clear to them that the tapping was not coming from the floor of the house they were on. It was coming from somewhere either on the first floor or maybe down in the basement. But, at first, the tapping sounds didn't really alarm them at all. It just sort of sounded like, house sounds at night. The sound of machines whirring or clicking, or maybe branches outside striking the side of the house, or who knows what. But they seemed sort of like harmless sounds that you would expect at night. However, as the tapping sort of persisted, it wasn't really consistent tapping sound. It was more sporadic, but it was consistently sporadic. Like it was obvious whatever this was, it wasn't stopping. As that continued, the girls began to tune in more and more to it and started wondering, like, what is this? And at some point, the younger of the two girls, Karen, the 9-year-old, she started to get spooked. The sound was kind of freaking her out. And so she got out of her bed and she left her room. She goes down the hallway. She comes into Tina's bedroom. And she goes up to her big sister and she's like, do you hear that tapping sound? And Tina's like, yeah, what is that? And so the two girls, they leave Tina's bedroom together. They go out into the hallway. They can still hear the tapping. It's kind of coming from downstairs somewhere. And the girls, they walk to the top of the stairs, basically looking down the stairwell that wraps down to the first floor. They can't see the first floor. They can only see, the halfway point, the landing. And they're hearing the tapping sound coming from somewhere down there. And the girls are just kind of listening, not really reacting. And at some point, one of the girls says, wait a minute. What if this tapping sound is Mom? What if the seance we did worked? What if she is here and now she's giving us a sign that she's with us right now? What if it's her? And so feeling sort of excited all of a sudden, one of the girls just says, Mom, is that you down there? And immediately there's a response. Something from downstairs is reacting to their question. And the girls are psyched. This is what they wanted when they did their seance. All they wanted was some interaction with their mother, and they think right now they're getting it. They're talking to their mom. And so after getting that tap, tap, tap response, one of the girls asks another question. Mom, if it's really you, give us another sign. Really show it's you. Something for sure is interacting with them downstairs. And the girls 100% believe it's their mother. And again, they are thrilled. And so the girls, they start walking down the stairs, firing off more questions to their mom. And even though some of their questions weren't really yes or no questions, they would always get that sort of tap, tap, tap response. Like, again, something is interacting with them. And as they made their way down to the first floor, and they're hearing this tapping, and they're sort of following it around, it eventually brings them to the head of the stairs that leads down into the basement. And they open up the basement door, and they're asking more questions. They're getting those tap responses, and it's clearly coming from downstairs. And even though the girls are really excited, it's gotta be Mom, they weren't so confident that they were prepared to go down into the basement to follow after this tapping sound. So they sort of stopped at the top of the stairs, looking down into the basement. It's gotta be Mom, but it's still a little bit frightening to go down there. And so they stayed there right above the stairs, looking into the basement, just constantly asking questions and getting responses from down in the basement from Mom. It was great. And eventually, after, 30 minutes, 45 minutes, whatever it was, the tapping just stopped. The girls continued asking questions, but there was no longer any reaction from the basement. And so at that point, the girls, they're so excited. They really feel like they've been talking to their mom, and they're so jazzed up from this experience that they're like, we're not going to be able to sleep. And so the girls just stay awake in the kitchen until Frank comes home from work. And when Frank comes inside and he sees his girls are awake, it's like midnight or whatever it is, he's sort of surprised. But the girls rush up to him and they're like, Dad, you wouldn't believe it. We had this seance and we heard this tapping sound and we know it was Mom. Mom is with us right now. We were talking to her. Now, Frank, he's totally caught off guard by what they're saying, but he also knows his girls, they're going through this horrible time in their lives. I mean, they've just lost their mother. He can't even imagine their level of grief. I mean, he's obviously grief-stricken, but this is their mom. And so he's seeing his girls for the first time in what feels like a long time, looking really happy and excited. And they're telling him that tapping sounds in the house are their mother. And so Frank, he's not going to pick holes in what they're doing. He's not going to question, what's actually happening in the house. Instead, as soon as they tell him all this stuff, he just goes, you know what, girls? Of course your mom is here. Your mom will always be here. She will always be looking out for you. Your mom is with you right now in the house. I'm sure of it. And so the girls, they're so happy. Again, this was such an amazing experience. Their dad, he also agreed this is so good. And so the girls, they happily go upstairs to their bedrooms, then they go to sleep. And Frank, truthfully, after having this exchange with his daughters, didn't really think much of it. Again, he's sort of thinking that, there wasn't really tapping sounds coming from his deceased wife. This is just some coping mechanism that the girls are using to deal with this tragedy. And he thinks, you know what? It's healthy enough. It's making them happy. What's the big deal? So Frank, he goes to bed. Over the next few days, the tapping sounds in the house would continue. And they were no longer just coming from the basement. They were also coming from the kitchen. They were coming sometimes from the second floor. They were sort of coming from all over the house. But the girls were the only ones who could hear the sounds. Every time they'd hear the tapping, if their dad was home, they'd call him over, but Frank wouldn't hear anything. Now again, Frank doesn't really believe that there's actually tapping happening. He doesn't think this is actually real at all. but he's playing along with it because, his girls are happy, clearly this is their coping mechanism. And so again, Frank's not thinking much of it. It's harmless. The girls are frustrated that he can't hear it, but again, it's overall still a very good thing. It's mom. Mom is trying to communicate with them. However, after a few days, post-seance, as the tapping continued, the girls began to change their attitude about the tapping sounds. The first day and over those first few days, it really did feel like a good thing. This is mom. This is positive. This was definitely a good thing. But after about 72 hours, post-seance, the girls began to sort of feel frightened by the tapping. Because the tapping no longer was really just coming mostly from the basement. It now started coming almost exclusively from their bedrooms at night. So they'd be laying in bed and they'd hear, tapping underneath their beds. They'd hear tapping in their closets. And it was frightening. And they would call their dad in and he'd come into their bedrooms and he wouldn't find anything. But now, Frank, who previously had just sort of let this continue, this is his girl's coping mechanism for this terrible loss. Now he's seeing that his girls, they don't really think it's mom anymore. They don't know what this is. And it's also disrupting their sleep. And so now it's not a healthy thing anymore. This is a problem. Like it's disrupting his girls' lives. And so Frank begins at this point, 3 days post-seance now, he begins telling his girls like, hey, come on guys, there's nothing to be scared of here. These tapping sounds are just normal house sounds. You're overthinking it. Like there's nothing that's going to harm you in the house. Mom is definitely here looking out for you, but she's not making those tapping sounds. You got to let this stuff go and just forget about this stuff. But the girls, they're like, Dad, we're not making the tapping sounds up. Just because you don't hear them does not mean they're not real. And they began to tell their dad, like, we think the seance worked, but we actually no longer think it's mom that's sort of come out of the seance. We think we unlocked a different spirit, an evil spirit. And now that evil spirit is haunting our house. And so Frank, at this point, he's like, guys, that's not what's going on here. You really need to stop. Like, these tapping sounds are not real. They're in your head or they're normal. And so Frank and his daughters really began to fight over this because the girls, they know they're hearing sounds and Frank's like, I'm not. And so they're really starting to fight over it. The girls, they're getting more and more frightened just being in their house, in particular at night when these sounds would typically start. And so fast forward about a week after the seance, and now the girls really are so scared to be in their house because of this tapping, which they believe is now this evil spirit in their house. They're finding all sorts of excuses to just stay out of their house. Like when dad's at work late, they're trying to stay at their friend's house and not be home because it was too frightening. And Frank, he's sort of at his wit's end with what to do with his girls, because now this thing that's going on in the house, this delusion, as he believed it was, that his girls were suffering from, it was really disruptive and unhealthy. And he began telling his girls, like, if you can't stop with this whole tapping delusion, you're going to have to go to grief counseling. Like, this is too much. And so, again, fast forward about a week here, and that's what's going on in the Bowen household. And on this particular day, the girls, Tina and Karen, they didn't have a place to go that night. They didn't have a friend who was available. And so they're home at their house alone. Frank's out for the night doing a late night shift. And the girls, they're in their kitchen just kind of hanging out. They're pretty anxious here. And they start to hear tapping sounds coming from the basement. Now, by this point, the tapping sounds were so common that just hearing the tapping sounds was not like this horribly frightening thing. It was just sort of this very unsettling thing where nobody knew what they were. And again, the girls think it's something evil. But on this night that the girls are alone, dad's gone, Tina, the older of the two, she says to Karen, like, Dad doesn't believe us. He does not believe that there's tapping sounds in the house. And so we, right now, need to go down in the basement and investigate. Because if we don't, no one's ever going to look into this. Like, nobody believes us. And Karen is horrified at the idea, Karen's the 9-year-old, of going down into the basement, to go see what this tapping is, but she doesn't want to be away from her sister, and so she's like, okay. And so Tina gets a knife from the kitchen, she goes to the door, to the basement, Karen follows right behind her, and Tina, she opens up the door, and the two girls begin going down the steps. And once they get to the bottom of the steps and they're in the basement, it's just this kind of blank slate down there. There's a washing machine and a dryer, there's some boxes, but it's just sort of a dank, sort of open, nothing cellar down there. And the girls, when they got down there, they're looking for the origin of this tapping sound. And on some level, they expected to find something that was making these sounds because they've been hearing these sounds. For them, it's not a delusion. Like every time they hear these sounds, they are real to them. Just because their dad doesn't hear it does not mean it's not real to them. And if you look at the beginning, when they first started hearing the sounds, they thought it was their mom. And they never really fully investigated. They maybe didn't want to find out that, perhaps the tapping sound was a washing machine or something, because that would destroy the illusion that it was their mom. So they never fully investigated then, and then the next few days after that, when it sort of transitioned and became a scary thing, the girls also never really investigated because it was scary now. They didn't want to know what was making this tapping sound. And so now here we are a week into this, and they've gone down into the basement where they've heard the tapping sounds, and they're like prepared to see something that is making this sound because it's real for them. Like maybe it's a raccoon or some animal that's gotten into their house. There has to be something because they hear these sounds. But now they're looking around this basement and there's nothing. There's nothing that could possibly be making this sound, and the girls are horrified. And so after being down there only for a couple of minutes, Tina, who's got the kitchen knife, she's like, Karen, let's get out of here. Like, this isn't right. Let's get out of here. And so the girls turn around and they begin going back up the steps. And as they do, they notice something on the stairway wall that they didn't see on the way down. Written in red on the wall are the words, "I'm in your closet, come find me." And when the girls see that, they are horrified. And they sprint up the stairs, they bolt out of their house, they go to their neighbor's house, start banging on the neighbor's door. The neighbor comes to the door and he's like, "What's going on?" And the girls are like, "Oh my God, we had this seance, we've been hearing tapping in the walls, and now somebody's written on the walls, we don't know what's going on." And the neighbor is so confused, really doesn't understand what's happening. And he's like, "Look, girls, just come into my house, you're safe here, we'll wait for your dad to come home, he'll know what to do." And so the girls, they're hysterical, they go into the neighbor's house, they shut the door, and they wait. And then a little bit later, Frank Bowen, their dad, he comes home. The neighbor immediately flags him down and calls him over. And he's like, "Look, here's what happened. Your girls came over. They said, something about writing on the walls. I don't know." And Frank's like, "Okay, all right." And he tells his girls, like, "Look, stay here. You're safe here. I'll go check the house and make sure nobody's in there." Frank at this point in no way suspects that there's anything, evil or bad in his house. He thinks this is just a continuation of this delusion the girls are sort of acting out. And so Frank, alone, goes back to his house. He opens up the door, he goes inside, he searches the house, and he looks everywhere, but there's nobody in the house. He does find the writing in the stairwell going down to the basement. It does say, "I'm in your closet, come find me," but it's written in ketchup. And so after, again, searching the whole house and finding nothing other than this writing, Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and he talks to his girls, and he's not mad at them. In some ways, he feels like all of this is basically his fault. Like, he should have handled this more aggressively at the beginning, and he let it get to this point. And so he tells his girls, like, "Look, I know that you wrote those words on the wall. I know that all of this is sort of a delusion that's playing out that started with, something good. You thought it was mom, but now it's become something that isn't good. It's disruptive. You've convinced yourself the house is haunted. And I'm very worried that this is a product of grief. Like, grief is leading you to do these things, and it needs to stop. And so starting tomorrow, you're going to go into grief counseling. We need professional help here to make sure you girls are taken care of. I should have done this from the beginning, so we're going to make that happen right now." Now, the girls knew they didn't write that on the wall. They're not making the tapping sounds, but they also knew their dad 100% didn't believe them, like zero, and it was not going to change. And on some level, they think maybe there's truth to what he's saying. Maybe they are so grief-stricken that they've convinced themselves of things that are not real. And so in this sort of vulnerable moment where the girls are totally upset about what they've seen and what they've heard, they just tell their dad, "Fine, whatever, we'll go to grief counseling." And so sure enough, the next day, the girls would start grief counseling, and right away, all the tapping in the house, all the writing on the walls, all that stuff stopped. Peace returned to the Bowen household, at least at first. Fast forward 3 weeks to December 8th, 1986. So this is 3 weeks after the girls began their therapy, and in those 3 weeks, the Bowen household is totally calm, there's no more tapping, nothing, everything is fine. But on December 8th, Frank, along with his 2 girls, Tina and Karen, and their friend, Kathleen, they had been out for the evening, maybe getting ice cream or going out to eat or whatever, and they come back to the Bowen household. And when they do, it's nighttime, so it's dark outside, and Frank, he goes up to the porch, he goes to the front door, and as he's about to open up the door, he looks through one of the windows of his house and he sees there are several lights on in the house that he didn't remember leaving on before they left. And so he just thinks like, that's weird. Like I could have sworn I turned those lights off. He's kind of looking back at the girls right behind him, sort of wondering if maybe they left the lights on, but he's like, oh, that's weird. So he unlocks the front door, he swings the door open, and immediately he sees this scene inside of his house that makes no sense. The TV is on, a radio is on, and furniture in the first floor of the house where he's looking has clearly been moved. Not dramatically, but things have been moved around on the first floor. Like if you live somewhere, you know where things go. Things are off. And Frank, like he's seeing this, and he's sort of looking back at Tina and Karen. He's like, did they do this? Are we back to this whole delusion? You gotta remember that even though it's been 3 weeks now of peace in the Bowen household, Frank is all too aware of how insane it was right before then. You know, with the girls, writing on the wall, at least according to him, and thinking there was an evil spirit in their house. And, he's thinking, is this them? Like, somehow did they do this? This feels sort of like a continuation of that. And he's looking at the girls, but he's thinking to himself, like, they've been with me. We've been out of the house. How could they do this? But again, Frank is sort of caught. On the one hand, he knows this could be his girls, but he's also thinking that's not possible. And so in that mind state of sort of being caught between these two opposing ideas, Frank, instead of backing out of the house and calling the police like anybody else would do, he instead just begins like walking into the house, sort of nonchalant, like not really sure how to react. And he begins this sort of half-cocked search through the house. And the whole time, Tina, Karen, and Kathleen, they see what's going on, and the two daughters, they're terrified. I mean, they're all too aware of all the tapping and the writing on the walls. They're thinking, this is real, it's happening again. And so they're tucked up right behind Frank, who again, Frank is like in shock. He's just like wandering through the house, like, what's going on here? Turns the TV off, he's walking around, turns the radio off, he's moving furniture back around, and he can't believe it. And so he does this weird, like again, half-invested search through the first floor. He doesn't find anybody there. He goes to the second floor, does the same search. Again, all three girls, the two daughters and the friend, they're right behind Frank because they're so scared. They do the search of the second floor, nobody there. They search the attic, nobody there either. They go down to the basement, nobody in the basement. Like there's nobody in the house. And so Frank is like, what is going on here? And then he remembers there's actually a room on the first floor of the house that he forgot to search. It was just a front room of the house right off the front entrance. When he began the search, he just sort of overlooked it because he was sort of in a daze. And so he's like, okay, I'll go back up there and I'll search that last room and then I'll know the whole house is secure. Nobody's here. And so Frank goes back up the basement stairs to the first floor. The girls are tucked up right behind him, still so scared. And he makes his way towards this room, and this room overlooks the front of the property. There are windows looking out to the road. It's just you walk in, there's windows, there's the front of the house, and there's a little closet over to the left. It's like a sitting room. And so Frank, he goes into this room, and right away, he sees on the wall right in front of him, written in shaving cream, are the words, "Marry me." And so Frank, he walks over to the words, and he's staring at them, being like, what is this? Like, who wrote this? The girls, again, are right behind him, tucked up against the back of his legs, and he's staring, and as he's doing that, he hears movement in the closet in the room that he's in. And Frank turns and he looks at this closet. The doors are open to this closet, but it's a dark closet. And out of the closet walks a man who was wearing a dress, Frank's dead wife's dress. This person had clown makeup on their face, and they were wielding a hatchet. And they walk out of the closet, and they look at Frank, and they look at the girls who are so shocked, they're just in silence staring back at the sky. And this person looks at Frank and goes, "You and the girls go upstairs." And so Frank immediately goes into protector mode, and he gets between the maniac and his girls, and he just tells the girls, like, go up the stairs, do what he says. And the hatchet-wielding maniac just sort of walks along, following after Frank and the girls. Again, Frank sort of staying between this person and the girls. And so Frank shepherds the girls up the stairs, and he's like, go ahead, girls, first bedroom, go in the first bedroom. So they go upstairs. All three girls go into the first bedroom. So Kathleen, Karen, Tina, and then Frank, he goes into the bedroom, and the maniac's right here in the hallway about to follow after Frank. And as soon as Frank gets in the door, Frank shuts the door and holds it shut. And there's suddenly this struggle between the maniac in the hallway and Frank. The maniac's trying to get in. There's this vicious struggle. And Tina, who's already in this bedroom, just turns, runs, and leaps out the second floor window. And so she smashes to the ground. She runs next door to that neighbor's house. She slams on the door. The neighbor comes out and Tina's screaming about, "There's someone in my house." And so the neighbor at this point knows this is a real emergency. They call the police. And then minutes later, the police show up. And when they get there, they look up at the Bowen household. And Frank Bowen is leaning out of that second floor bedroom. And he's screaming to the police, "Hey, there's somebody in here. He was just at my door. He's gone. I don't know where he is." And police, they get over. They put a ladder up to the window. Frank comes down. They get the other two girls down. So everybody is safely out of the house now. They've been moved over to that neighbor's house. And now the police are going to go into the Bowen household to find this dress-wearing, hatchet-wielding, clown makeup-wearing maniac. They're going to find him and put him into custody. And so the police, they go into the Bowen household, guns drawn, and they search that entire property, top to bottom, and they find nothing. Nobody's there. The house is completely vacant. However, they would find a hatchet lying by the back sliding glass door, and the back sliding glass door was partially open. And so ultimately, again, when nobody is found inside the house, the police decide, well, clearly this maniac, if there really was a maniac, is now gone. Because look, the door's open, the hatchet's here, so they're gone. And so the police, they go over and talk to Frank and his family, and they're like, look, we don't really know what to make of this. We didn't actually see, this person you claim to have seen in your house. I'm sure there was somebody, but we didn't see them. And so for now, what we're going to do is we're going to monitor your property 24/7 and just see what happens, see if anybody comes in or out. We'll make sure nobody comes to this property, and we'll also begin an investigation in town to try to figure out, who this maniac was. And in the meantime, you and your girls go stay with a family friend or something. Just don't be here because we don't know what's going on here. And so Frank and his girls, they went and stayed with a family friend, and the police began their surveillance of the Bowen household. And for 2 days, nothing happened. Nobody went in or out of the Bowen household. And despite police canvassing the town and trying to figure out, who this maniac could have been, they really didn't get anywhere. Because remember, Frank's description and the girl's description of this maniac was, probably a man wearing a dress with clown makeup on. And so effectively, this person had a disguise on. There was nothing to go on. So they couldn't find anybody in town. There was no leads, and nobody has come to this house. And they're communicating with Frank Bowen the whole time. Basically, nothing's coming of this case. And so finally, 48 hours after, confronting this maniac in the closet, Frank and his girls, they've been at the family friend's house this whole time. And Frank's like, you know what, it'd be great to get my toiletries and a few other things from my house, because basically they evacuated their house and didn't get a chance to pack or anything. And Frank's thinking, nothing's going on at the house. There's no leads in this case. It's got to be safe to go back to my house for a minute and get the things I need. And so he tells his girls to stay with his family friend, and Frank, by himself, goes over to his house, and it's broad daylight, and he's expecting to find a police officer, who's monitoring his property, and he can tell the officer, hey, I'm just going in real quick to get my stuff, and they would, let him go in and do that. But when he got to his house, he looked around, and he didn't see any police officer outside the property watching the property. And he's thinking, that's pretty weird. They told me they've been watching my property 24/7, where are they? But Frank's like, that's weird, whatever. So he gets out of his car and begins walking towards his front door. But as he's walking, for a second, out of the corner of his eye, he can swear he can see somebody moving in the second floor of his house. But when he looked up, nobody was there. But he was certain somebody had been moving around up there. And Frank's thinking to himself, wait a minute. Are the police monitoring my house from the inside? Is that what they're doing? They've been in my house? I could have sworn they said they were out of my house. And Frank's like, you know what, just in case, I need to call the police because I don't want to walk in there and startle an armed police officer who's basically looking for an intruder. And so Frank, he goes to that neighbor's house and uses their phone and he calls the police and he's like, hey, are you in my house? Is that what you guys have been doing? You've been monitoring my house from the inside? And they're like, no, we have been watching it from the outside. Very likely what's happened here is you've arrived at your house at the exact moment when there is turnover happening between the police officers who are watching it from the outside. Meaning the officer who's been watching your house must have just left, and the incoming officer who will be taking over the next shift is probably on their way, or maybe they're there right now. And in fact, what you should do, Frank, is hang up with us, go back to your property, and very likely the officer will be there or be there soon, and you can talk to them and have them search your house just in case to make sure nobody's in there. And so Frank says, okay, he hangs up the phone, he goes outside, and sure enough, now there is clearly a police officer in a car outside of his property. So Frank goes over and, explains the situation to the officer, and the officer's like, no one's going inside your property. Literally, we have watched this property 24/7, save for a couple of minutes here and there when we're doing turnover, but nobody's gone in or out of your property. But either way, Frank, I'll search your house just to be sure. And so Frank goes back over to the neighbor's house, and this officer goes up to Frank's door. He opens it up, he looks inside, and he can't believe what he's looking at. In the first floor of Frank's house, it's just madness. There are pennies glued to the ceiling of the first floor, and the furniture clearly has been moved all over the place, but it's been stacked in these sort of weird arrangements. And there are glasses of champagne all over the first floor, and there are kitchen knives that have been driven into family photos on the wall. Like the knives are still sticking into the photo, and where these knives have been driven through the photo is always on a picture of either Tina or Karen, the two daughters. And where there are knives in these pictures, above those pictures is written, "I'm going to kill you, Tina," or "I'm going to kill you, Karen." And so this officer obviously knows, we have a problem here. And so he backs out of the house, he calls for reinforcements, and so all these officers go in, guns drawn, now convinced, clearly somebody has found a way to come in and out of this house, or they're still here, and we have to find them. Like, clearly, the Bowens were not lying about this horrible, maniac that they encountered in the second floor of their house when police first showed up. Clearly, that must have happened, because they didn't do this, somebody else did, and they gotta be here. And so police, they tear the Bowen household apart, looking for this maniac. They look everywhere, and they can't find anybody. There's nobody in the house. And on top of that, it had snowed outside, and before they went in, they made sure they walked around the property to see if there were footsteps coming in or out of the property, and there wasn't. Like, it's not possible what they're seeing. But they've now torn the house up, looking for anything, and they found nothing. Other than, again, the madness they've seen with the furniture, the writing, the knives, that's all they've found. And so after hours and hours of this very frustrating search, a few of the officers found themselves in the basement, and they're just standing there talking to each other like, this is crazy. We must have missed something. Like, what is it? And at some point, one of those officers who was having that conversation, he had his hand resting on the washing machine, and he's just sitting there like, yeah, what did we miss? What did we miss? And suddenly, as he's leaning against the washing machine moved. And so suddenly there's this gap that's been created by moving the washing machine, and the officer looks at the wall where the machine had been sitting before, and clearly there is a hole on the wall. And the officer gets out his flashlight, and he looks in the wall and kind of scans down, and he sees there's this tunnel that's been burrowed in the wall of the basement, and it goes over to the corner, and looking back at this officer is Danny LaPlante. And he's crouched down, he's got a hatchet over his shoulder, he's wearing a dress, and he's staring back at this officer. I'm going to tell you about Danny LaPlante because this story takes a very dark turn. So Danny LaPlante was 16 years old at the time he was pulled out of the wall. And 6 months prior to being pulled out of the Bowen household's wall, Danny had had this very brief interaction with Tina Bowen, the 15-year-old. Apparently they went to school together or had some interaction in town, but Danny had sort of fallen in love or had some sort of romantic interest in Tina, and he felt like Tina had rejected him. Now, Tina did not remember any of this with Danny. This is entirely Danny's memory of what happened. But either way, 6 months earlier, when he had this sense of rejection from Tina, Danny responded to that by breaking into the Bowen household, cutting a hole in their walls, and burrowing tunnels in their walls. And for 6 months, Danny LaPlante lived in the Bowen household in their walls. Now, Danny was not able to access the entire house through the wall in the basement. He could basically maneuver in the basement and partially into the first floor, but in order to get to the other parts of the house, Danny had to leave the wall. And so routinely, over these 6 months that he was in their house, Danny would literally, while the family was home, just get out and wander through their house, like as the family is just living there, and they never noticed him. And so for 6 months, Danny spied on that family 24/7. And when the girls had that seance with the Ouija board to try to contact their mother, Danny was downstairs in the basement in the walls watching, and he saw an opportunity. He thought, I'm going to pretend to be their mother and screw with them. And so when they heard that tapping sound, that was Danny pretending to be their mom. He was absolutely trying to get them to believe their mother was here. But then whenever Frank was around, Danny would stop the tapping and sort of let Frank believe the girls were making it up. And then gradually, Danny sort of transitioned from "it's your mom and it's good" to actively trying to terrify the girls. He began tapping at all hours of the night. He began sneaking out of the wall, going upstairs to the girls' bedroom, flicking the undersides of their beds, going in their closet, tapping in their closet, and then making sure to be hidden or escape before Frank came in. I mean, this is absolutely psychotic behavior, but it gets worse. So Danny is taken out of the walls and he's arrested, but then 10 months later, when he is awaiting trial, Danny is released on bail. And while he is on bail, he would sneak into another family's house in Massachusetts, the Gustafsons' house, and unfortunately, that family would not escape Danny. Danny would murder 3 members of that family for really no particular reason. He just picked a family and killed them. And so very likely, if Tina had not leapt out of the second floor window when Danny revealed himself in that dress with the hatchet and got them to go up to that bedroom, if Tina hadn't leapt out and if Frank hadn't held off the door like that, almost certainly Danny was corralling that family into that room to kill them with the hatchet. But Tina basically saved their lives. Danny LaPlante is still alive, and he's serving multiple consecutive life sentences, and he actually recently was put up for parole. He didn't get it, he did not get parole, but during his hearing for his parole, when he was rejected, he was determined to be one of the most psychopathic inmates. On a snowy morning in 1972, 22-year-old Sotria Kritsonis sat at her bus stop in Seattle, Washington, adjusting her knit cap against the cold. The hat actually still felt pretty weird on her head because just a few days earlier, she had cut her brown hair super short, and so she wasn't quite used to it yet. But despite that, she loved her new hair. In fact, she couldn't wait to show it off at her school. She'd deliberately worn this big hat to hide her haircut, because this would make the reveal to her friends at school that much better. She glanced up Rainer Avenue for any sign of her bus, but there wasn't one. The city's public transportation system was all out of whack that day because of the weather, and so Tria was becoming pretty impatient because now her bus was over an hour late. She'd already missed her first class of the day because of this bus, and now she was in danger of missing her second class. And that's when she heard the beep of a car horn, and a pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle rolled up to the curb right in front of her. So Tria had to squint through the snow, but she could see the silhouette of a man in the driver's seat of this car, and he was rolling down the window of the passenger side and kind of waving her over. Curious, she walked up to the now open window and leaned in, and the warmth coming from inside the car felt great. And this is where Sotria got her first real look at the driver. He was a good-looking guy in his 20s, he was well-dressed, pleasant-seeming, just an overall normal-looking person. He explained that he'd actually been driving on Rainer Ave for a while, and he hadn't seen a bus in a long time, and so he offered to give Sotria a ride to her school. But remember, this is the 1970s, and hitchhiking at the time in America was pretty common, especially on the West Coast where Sotria was. And so pretty quickly, she agreed to get in because she knew this likely was her best chance at making it to school for her second class, and she was freezing. After the man pulled back onto Rainer Avenue, Sotria sat back in the seat, enjoying the warm air blasting out of the vents. And as she did, she looked out her window at the familiar route passing by. Sotria was about to apologize to this guy for making him drive so far out of his way when she heard him turn on his blinker. He was preparing to turn right. And this struck Sotria as odd because as she had explained to him back on the curb, her school was a straight shot down Rainer Ave. There was no need to turn, so what was he doing? Sotria looked over at the man, expecting him to explain why they were taking this sudden detour, but the man just stared straight ahead. And then a moment later, she heard the blinker turned on again, and she looked up and saw they were about to merge onto Interstate 5 southbound, which was definitely not the way to Sotria's school. And now Sotria felt a pang of fear. She opened her mouth to tell this guy he was going the wrong way, but he cut her off. And he looked at her and he said, "You know, it's a terrible idea to take a ride from a stranger." The man kept on talking as he merged onto the highway, but Sotria was not listening at all. Instead, she was fixated on what he was doing with his right hand. His left hand was on the wheel, but with his right hand, he was fishing for something underneath his seat. And so Sotria's mind began to race. Without taking her eyes off of this man and what he was doing, she traced with her hand and felt for the door handle, but she couldn't feel it. And then she turned and realized there was no door handle. It had been removed. Just then, the man stopped rummaging around underneath his seat. Whatever he was looking for, he had found it. The man sat partway up and looked at Sotria with his hand still hidden behind one of his legs and a determined but emotionless expression on his face. At this point, Sotria felt her heart hammering so hard in her chest that she was worried she might pass out from terror. All she could think about was, what is he hiding behind his leg? What was underneath his seat? But then, something strange happened. The man's face changed from determined and almost cruel to confused. Sotria watched as his eyes darted up to the top of her head. The man told Sotria to take off her hat, and with trembling hands, she did as she was instructed, although she had no idea why he was asking. And when the hat was off her head, the man looked shocked, and he dropped whatever it was he had found back under his seat, and Sotria heard it land with a heavy metallic thud, but she couldn't see it. There was a long, tense silence, and then when the man finally spoke, he just said, "Why did you cut your hair?" The man immediately got off the highway and drove fast to Sotria's school. When they got there, he opened up the door for her and told Sotria to get out and said she was lucky. Then he drove away. Sotria didn't report this encounter to police. She was kind of embarrassed that she had gotten into a stranger's car in the first place, and after all, the guy, despite being really creepy, hadn't hurt her at all, and so she basically just tried to forget about it. But a few years later, in 1975, Sotria was watching TV when she saw a familiar face come onto the screen. It was the man who had given her a ride, being led into a courtroom in handcuffs. Sotria dropped everything and turned up the volume, and what she heard made her numb with horror. Because the newscaster was saying that this man who had given her a ride was a suspected serial killer accused of murdering dozens of young women who he would lure into his pale yellow Volkswagen Beetle and then bludgeon them to death with a crowbar or tire iron. And he had a very specific type when it came to identifying his victims. They were young women who all had long brown hair. And this man's name was Ted Bundy. Our next story is called The Box. Late one afternoon in April of 2019, a middle-aged woman named Mary was cutting up some vegetables in her kitchen in northern Spain when she heard a knock on her front door. So she put her things down, she went to the door, opened it up, and standing there was her next-door neighbor, who was all smiles, and she was holding this big box that was wrapped in wrapping paper and had a big bow on it, and then sitting on top of this big gift was a tray of deep-fried rolls, or croquettes. Mary's neighbor was a 61-year-old woman named Carmen Marino, who was an exceptional chef, and her specialty were making these croquettes. They were filled with different types of meat and other things, and all the time, Carmen would come over and give them to Mary, and Mary loved these croquettes. And so as soon as she saw those, she was like, wow, amazing, and she invited Carmen inside. But Carmen didn't come inside. Instead, she took the croquettes and handed them to Mary, and Mary's like, okay, great, thank you. But Carmen was still standing right outside holding this box, and now Mary's looking at her thinking that Carmen looks kind of uneasy. And so Mary said, what's going on here? What's up with this box? Carmen was silent for a second and just kind of held this box out, at which point Mary realized, okay, so she's trying to give me this gift. And so Mary reached out and took this huge present, and she was like, thank you, Carmen. Like, what is this? What's going on? And Mary, when she looked at Carmen, she could tell Carmen's face was now bright red. She was very embarrassed about something, maybe whatever she was going to say. And so Mary just waited for Carmen to speak. And so eventually Carmen she would clear her voice, and then she would say, Mary, this is really embarrassing, but I need you to hold on to this box for a little bit. It contains my sex toys, and I'm having company over at my house, and I'm just worried that somehow they're going to find these things. Mary was so caught off guard by what Carmen was telling her that she just started laughing. But Carmen didn't join in on the laughter. she just kind of looked down like she was totally mortified. Mary stopped laughing because she felt bad, and then Carmen kind of elaborated on why she had this huge box full of sex toys. She would tell Mary that, she bought them with the intent of using them with her boyfriend, but a couple of months ago he had broken up with her. But Carmen had held on to these in the hopes that the boyfriend would eventually take her back and they would get back together again and get to use these toys. And so even though this was a totally weird and kind of uncomfortable request, Mary kind of felt bad for Carmen. One, because she had to make this request of Mary, but also two, it was obvious that Carmen was pretty shaken up about, losing her boyfriend. And so Mary said, you know what? No problem, Carmen. I will look after your sex toys and I will enjoy your croquettes. And Carmen was so relieved and said, thank you so much. And then she turned and hustled back to her house. And then Mary shut the door and she brought the croquettes into the kitchen and she tried one and it was so good. And then she took the big box of sex toys and she went into the hallway. She opened up a closet and she put it on the top shelf and then shut the door. Over the next couple of days, Mary expected Carmen to come back over and reclaim her box of sex toys. But Carmen didn't. And when days turned into weeks and then turned into months, and still Carmen had not come over to get the sex toys, Mary was kind of annoyed, but she was just too embarrassed to go over to Carmen and be like, hey, why don't you come over and get your sex toys? And so Mary just decided she would leave it alone and not talk about it. And if ever Carmen wanted them back, she could have them. But if she never asked for them again, Mary didn't care. She would just eventually throw the box away, and that would be it. A few months later, on September 29th, 2019, so we're talking about 6 months or so from when the sex toys were first brought over to Mary's house. Well, on this day, Mary was kind of doing chores in her house when she began to smell a really bad smell coming from the hallway closet where the box of sex toys were. And so Mary opened up the closet, and for sure, she could tell the bad smell was coming from this closet. And so she started by smelling the shoes that were towards the bottom of the closet to see if maybe she had stepped in something gross, but they were all clean. And then eventually she reached the sex toy box. She pulled it down from the top shelf, and it had never been opened. It's still wrapped, but she just smelled the box and she immediately recoiled because that had to be where the terrible smell was coming from. It was coming from this box. And so Mary was totally repulsed at the idea that these sex toys smell horrible, but she carried the box into the kitchen and set it down. And she thought, is this a horrible betrayal of my friend's trust if I open up this box and look at her sex toys? But Mary ultimately was like, you know what? Carmen has not come back for this thing. I'm opening this up because I need to know what's making this smell. So Mary went over and got a pair of scissors and she cut off the wrapping paper and then she opened up the box. And inside was like this big thing that had been wrapped in tinfoil. So all you saw was tinfoil. And so Mary, she reached down and kind of began to peel back the tinfoil. It was kind of sticking to whatever was under it. But eventually, after she kind of yanked on it, she pulled the tinfoil off. And when she saw what was in there, she began screaming and ran outside and called the police. It would turn out Mary's neighbor, Carmen, who owned the box of sex toys, well, her boyfriend didn't just break up with her a couple of months before she brought the sex toys over. No, her boyfriend, who was a 67-year-old man named Jesus Baranda, he went missing around the time that supposedly Carmen and her boyfriend broke up. And so naturally, Jesus's family began looking for Jesus, and when they couldn't find him, they called the police. And eventually the police called Carmen and said, hey, you were dating Jesus around the time he went missing. We're going to need to come to your house and search it. And when Carmen heard that, she knew she had a big problem. Because Carmen had murdered Jesus and cut his head off with a chainsaw, and she still had his head in her house. And so what did she do? Well, she boiled his head down, and then she put it in a box, wrapped it in tinfoil, and then she wrapped that box in wrapping paper, put a bow on it, and then went next door to Mary's house and said, hey, can you hold my sex toys for me? Because she knew Mary would likely not look in the box if it was sex toys. And so Mary took the box, put it in her closet, and then of course, the smell began several months later, and she would discover Jesus's head. Carmen was convicted of murdering her boyfriend, and she was sentenced to 15 years in prison. Police were never able to locate the rest of Jesus. All they had was his head. But there's a running theory that Carmen may have used the rest of her boyfriend's body and ground it up and then baked him into her croquettes that she gave out to people like Mary and other people in her neighborhood. But that's just a theory. The next and final story of today's episode is called, What's That Smell? On the evening of June 7th, 2023, a 36-year-old man named Umar Abdullah walked into his bedroom in Tampa Bay, Florida, and right away he opened up all the windows. Now, keep in mind, Tampa Bay, Florida is really hot. And so by doing this, he was letting in all this really hot air, but Umar did not care. He just wanted whatever was inside of his apartment out. Umar, along with his wife Samira and their 10-month-old daughter, had just gotten back to their apartment after a trip to Ohio, and the second they walked inside, they had smelled this weird smell. And it was something they had never smelled before. This was not like rotten food or anything like that. This was like a chemical smell. But even that wasn't a good description. It was like a cross between chemicals and maybe paint. And so at first, Umar and Samira just walked around their apartment, predominantly in the kitchen, looking for things that could be leaking, in the fridge or in cupboards or whatever, but they couldn't find anything that seemed like it could be the cause of the smell. And it was around this point, when they were totally stumped, that Umar and Samira remembered that their apartment building was extremely well taken care of. Like, repairs were done immediately and all the time in every single unit, and the fact that they had been away in Ohio had been known to their apartment manager, and so they thought, maybe while they were gone, maybe somebody had come in here and maybe touched up some paint or made some repairs or something, even though it seemed a bit weird that they hadn't been informed beforehand that, painting or repairs were going to take place in their apartment, but ultimately that's what they chalked it up to. And so it was at this point that Umar and Samira walked all around the apartment, opening up all the windows, and Samira also lit a candle as well, and pretty soon that weird smell disappeared, and both the parents just kind of forgot about it. And so Umar grabbed all their luggage from their trip and began unpacking it into the drawers and putting toiletries away, and at the same time, Samira put their baby in a high chair in the kitchen, and then Samira began preparing dinner. And a few minutes later, as Umar was still putting things away, he heard Samira calling from the kitchen to, hey, come out here for a second. And so Umar stopped what he was doing, he went into the kitchen, and he looked at Samira, and she was looking very concerned down at their daughter. And their daughter was in her high chair, and her dinner was right in front of her, but she wasn't eating. And their daughter seemed really fussy. And normally, their daughter was such a get-along kid who never fussed, who always ate her food, and so this seemed really out of character. And so both parents kind of stared at the daughter for a second, and then Umar was like, you know what, all the windows are still open and it's getting pretty hot in here. Maybe the baby's just fussy about the heat. And so Samira agreed that could totally be it, and so the parents went around the apartment, closing down all the windows, allowing the air conditioning to kick back on and cool the apartment down. But about an hour later, after the apartment had cooled back down, the baby was still very fussy. And at this point, Umar and Samira were trying to put the baby to bed, and they were really struggling with that. And also, in addition to the baby obviously not feeling very well, Umar and Samira both began to complain that they had headaches. And so at this point, the parents assumed that, all of this, the baby's behavior and now our headaches must be tied to just the travel we just went through, and we just need a day to recover here. And so they kind of rushed their baby through her bedtime routine and eventually got her down. And then Umar and Samira took some ibuprofen to help with their headaches. And then they too climbed in bed and drifted off to sleep, hoping that when they woke up, everybody would feel better again. But the next morning, nobody was better. In fact, everybody was doing worse. Umar's headache had now gotten much stronger, and Samira, she still had a headache, but also was very lethargic, and the baby was still very fussy. And over the next few days, their symptoms continued to get worse and worse. Umar's headache went from really bad to pretty much blinding, like he couldn't do anything else but think about his headache. And Samira basically had to lay down all day. It was like no matter how much she slept, she had zero energy, and their poor baby just continued to cry and fuss all the time, and even began to vomit. And so it seemed pretty obvious by this point, after a few days, that the three of them must have caught some sort of bug while they were traveling, that this was not just jet lag, that they actually had some sort of illness. But the parents were convinced that, they could just kind of rough it out, and eventually, after a couple of days, they would get better. But on the morning of June 14th, so this is now a week after coming back home from their trip, not only were all their symptoms still really bad, but on this particular morning, things took a dark turn. That morning, when Umar went to his daughter's bedroom, he's still dealing with this horrible headache, he makes his way into the bedroom, and he goes down to pick his daughter up from her crib, and as he's reaching down to grab her, he freezes. because on the bed, on the pillow right behind the baby, is all the baby's hair. The baby had clearly lost huge chunks of her hair. And so Umar at this point forgot about his headache and yelled for Samira. And even though she's super lethargic, she could tell this is an emergency. So she got up and made her way into the bedroom, and she looked down too and saw all the hair, and she reached down and scooped the baby up, and she turned the baby over. And sure enough, there was a huge bald spot on the back of their baby's head. But Umar and Samira, they said to each other right away that, wait a minute, I know this is scary, but it is actually a thing that newborn babies sometimes do lose their hair. But when they went online and looked at the age range of when that's kind of a common thing to happen, it was pretty obvious that their baby, being 10 months old, was a little bit too old for losing her hair to be considered a normal thing. And so Umar and Samira sat there and continued Googling, what could this be? My 10-month-old baby is losing her hair. And there were lots of explanations ranging from, ringworm to some severe infection to some rare genetic disorder. And all of it was kind of terrifying, and also none of it really lined up with what they were seeing with their daughter. And so the parents were like, you know what? Clearly, we don't know what this is. We've all been sick for a week. We have to bring our baby to the doctor. And so as Samira got on the phone and called the baby's doctor, Umar hopped in the shower to get ready to go to the doctor. And as soon as he began shampooing his hair, he noticed clumps of his hair were falling out. And so all of a sudden, it dawned on him that whatever's going on with his baby is going on with him, and very likely going on with his wife too. And it was at this point too that Umar remembered that strange smell when they first walked into their apartment after coming back from their trip. Now, they had opened up all the windows and lit candles, and the smell had kind of dissipated, and then they had shut the windows again and they hadn't smelled it again. And so Umar began thinking, wait a minute, maybe we've just gone nose blind to the smell, and maybe there's some sort of contamination in the air. Maybe there's a gas leak or something worse than that. And so as soon as Umar got out of the shower and told his wife about how he lost hair and kind of his theory that maybe there was some contamination in their apartment, Umar called his landlord and explained, the whole situation. And the landlord would tell Umar right off the top that, during the time they were in Ohio, nobody went inside their apartment. So there's no fresh paint in there, no maintenance was done. So whatever you smelled was not from us. And then the landlord said to Umar that, as scary as it sounds, it's possible that you might have like a gas leak inside of your apartment, or maybe you have a freon leak from your air conditioning system, or maybe there's toxic mold. But whatever it is, we're going to get people in there, we're going to find the issue and solve it. And so later that day, sure enough, a gas inspector showed up to Umar and Samira's apartment, and they checked the entire place, and they could not find any trace of a gas leak. They checked everywhere. There was no leak, but they did tell Umar and Samira that yes, we can smell a faint trace of some chemical smell, but we don't think it's gas. And then after the gas inspector left, the landlord went out and found a mold inspector who came into Umar and Samira's apartment. They looked everywhere and could not find any mold. Then the landlord brought in a plumber to check the hot water heater, but no issues with that. Then the landlord brought an HVAC company in, and they checked the air conditioning units, and there was no leak. And so finally, after the landlord had kind of run out of ideas for who to bring over to check the apartment, because again, by this point, nobody had found anything wrong with the apartment, Umar just said, you know what, I'm going to call the fire department. And so Umar, he calls the fire department, and the fire department, they send over their hazardous materials team or their hazmat team. And so they go into the apartment and they look everywhere, and there is nothing. They could not find any source that was causing the smell at all. It seemed very much like their apartment was totally safe and fine. But by this point, it's now been 2 weeks since Umar, Samira, and their baby had come back from that trip, and they still felt totally horrible. Umar still had his headaches, he was still losing his hair, Samira had begun losing her hair as well, she still had her headaches, she still felt lethargic, and their baby was still losing her hair, and she still was fussy and miserable. And all three of them now had developed this weird shortness of breath, where they'd just be walking through the apartment, and suddenly it was like they couldn't even breathe. And so now they've had all these people who can't find anything wrong with their apartment, they'd gone to their doctors, and the doctors had no idea what was wrong with them. And so it was kind of like they had no idea what to do, but clearly this crisis was only getting worse and worse and worse. And so Umar felt like he had no more options. He couldn't leave his apartment. He couldn't afford to do that. And so they were just stuck in this place that seemed toxic. But all that would change on June 25th, so 2.5 weeks after they came home from that trip, because on this day, Umar discovered something about that chemical smell they caught right when they came back in after the trip. The smell that all the people that had come into the apartment had sort of noticed but couldn't identify. On June 25th, Umar figured something out about that smell. And so on this day, Umar was in his apartment feeling completely miserable, as was his wife and his daughter who were in the bedroom. But at some point, Umar suddenly caught a whiff of that weird chemical smell. And as soon as he smelled it, he sort of began to cough, and he was about to call his landlord and be like, "Hey, I smelled it again." But he decided on this day, instead of calling anybody else, he was going to run an experiment of his own. And so instead of trying to get away from the smell, Umar began smelling in the air as deep as he could to try to kind of figure out where the smell was coming from. And so he began walking around his apartment, sniffing the air, kind of tracing the smell. And slowly but surely, he began kind of following the smell through his kitchen, down the hallway, all the way to his front door. And when he got to his front door, he smelled it again, and he could tell the smell was the strongest right now. And so feeling a sudden jolt of adrenaline, he grabbed the door, flung it open, half expecting to see like a chemical cloud floating in the air in the hallway. But as soon as he opened the door, there was nothing outside. And when he smelled in the hallway, the smell wasn't really there anymore. And so he kind of looked around for a second, feeling kind of silly, and then he shut the door, and he was about to just go back into his apartment and just kind of accept that once again, I got no idea what's going on here. But then he stopped, and he turned back around and looked at the actual door, like the actual front door of his apartment. And he began smelling the door, and the door definitely had the chemical smell. And so he began smelling and tracing his hands all over this door, not even sure what he was looking for, but eventually he worked his way all the way to the bottom of the door. And that's when he felt something. And so suddenly Umar got down and stared at the strange thing he had found on his door. And as soon as he saw what it was, he jumped up and ran to his wife to tell her what he had just found. After talking with his wife about this thing, they came up with a plan. Late that night, Umar waited until the entire apartment complex seemed really quiet, and then as quietly as he could, he opened up that front door, he stepped out into the hallway, and then he made his way over to the big fake plant that stood at the end of this hallway that was kind of right outside, kind of adjacent to his door, and he hid something in the plant, and then Umar went back into his apartment and he shut the door. And on June 27th, so 2 days later, the moment Umar and Samira had been waiting for finally arrived. At around 5:30 p.m. that evening, suddenly that chemical smell began to emanate through the apartment, and their baby began coughing so badly she began vomiting. And so as Samira was tending to their baby, Umar very quietly opened up his front door, looked in the hallway, didn't see anyone, and he rushed over to that plant, and he took the thing he had hidden a couple of days before, and he went back into his apartment, shut the door, and went into his office. And when Umar came out of that office a little while later, Samira was waiting and she was looking at him, and as Umar came out, it was like he was totally ashen-faced, he looked completely shocked, and he could barely speak. And Samira said, "What's going on? What did you learn?" And Umar said, "We have to get out of here right now. Get the baby. We have to leave right now. We're going to the hospital." And so as Samira bundled up their baby and they started getting their things together, Umar called 911 and told the operator what he had just discovered. The strange thing Umar had discovered on his front door 2 days earlier on June 25th was a weird crack at the very base of his door where you could basically see from inside of his apartment out into the hallway. And the thing Umar and his wife had decided to hide in the hallway in that plant was a video camera aimed at their front door, because they were suspicious that something was making its way through that crack in the door into their apartment, and they wanted to catch it on camera. And that's exactly what happened 2 days later when around 5:30 p.m., their daughter began coughing and Umar began to smell that smell in the apartment, and he rushed out, he got his camera, he went back into his office, he watched the footage, and he could not believe what his camera had recorded. Just before 5:30 p.m. on June 25th, so right before the smell came into the apartment, on video, you see this guy walk up the stairs and enter the hallway right in front of Umar and Samira's apartment door. And this man had a syringe in his hand, and he knelt down and he placed the syringe into that crack at the bottom of Umar and Samira's door, and he pushed the plunger of the syringe before pulling the syringe out, quickly turning and disappearing down the stairs. And so as Umar and Samira and their baby rushed to the hospital after discovering this video and after calling 911 to tell police what they saw on this video, the police rushed to Umar and Samira's apartment complex. Not to go to Umar and Samira's apartment though, instead to go to the apartment right below Umar and Samira. The man who rented that apartment right below them was a 36-year-old named Zuming Lee. He was a married father of two who was working on his PhD in chemistry from the University of South Florida, and Umar and Samira thought of him as being a really nice guy. You know, he was very quiet, he kept to himself, he even gave them a gift after their daughter was born. But on this evening, when the police arrived at Zuming's apartment and knocked on the door, when Zuming opened it up, he was immediately arrested. It would turn out, despite Zuming giving Umar and Samira that gift after their baby was born, well, that was the end of him liking Umar and Samira. Because as soon as they came home with their baby, Zuming became obsessed with how noisy their baby was. Even if their baby was barely being loud, it completely consumed Zuming's mind. It was like he was obsessed with listening for this baby. And then suddenly it wasn't just the baby that annoyed him, it was even the slightest noise he heard above him coming from Umar and Samira's apartment that totally sent him into a rage. And so Zuming began constantly going to the homeowners association to complain about the baby and, the toilet sounds and the footsteps he was hearing. And when that wasn't enough, he began going to the police about it. Now, Umar and Samira had been told that their downstairs neighbor really was upset with how loud they were being, and so they did everything they could to be quiet. They felt so bad that they were coming off as being these very loud and disrespectful people, which they were not. I mean, they did have a little baby, and babies make noise, but they were doing everything they could to be quiet. And so they had no idea that Zuming was still just completely furious at them. And eventually, Zuming's fury just became completely unhinged, and he used his chemistry know-how, because remember, he's studying for his PhD in chemistry, to begin putting together this deadly mixture of chemicals that contain things like methadone and hydrocodone, and he put them into a syringe, and he began injecting them into Umar and Samira's apartment to poison them to make them be quiet. And so by the time Zuming was arrested, he had been injecting these deadly chemicals into their apartment for a month. That was obviously the cause of all of Umar and Samira and their baby's symptoms. It was this poison. Umar, Samira, and their baby would get treatment and they would fully recover from their poisoning. But very likely, had they not been quick thinkers and put that camera in place and caught Zuming in the act, it's entirely possible that over time, the poison that was being injected into their apartment would have killed them. Officials are still investigating this case as it's still relatively new. However, the legal process was paused when Zuming was deported back to China. Zuming has not been convicted of any crime, and the criminal case remains open, and if Zuming ever were to step foot on US soil, he would be arrested immediately.
Before The Bachelorette pitted 30 men against each other to win one woman's heart, Americans watched another show about random strangers competing for a mate. It was called The Dating Game. Starting in 1965, this reality show featured a woman asking 3 men questions without seeing their faces, and based on their answers, at the end of the show, she would choose one to go on a date with. On the surface, the September 13th, 1978 showing of The Dating Game looks like every other episode with lots of unsubtle innuendo, but this episode would go down in history as a one-of-a-kind, and not in a good way. At the end of this particular show, it was time for the Bachelorette, Cheryl Bradshaw, to make her decision, and she would choose Bachelor number 1, who would turn out to be this tall, good-looking, long-haired guy whose name was Rodney. Rodney comes around the partition and they see each other for the first time and everybody laughs and they hug, and the show looks like every other show, and on stage, Rodney looks like every other contestant that's ever been on the show. But after the show ended and Cheryl and Rodney went backstage and actually began having a real conversation that was not being filmed, Cheryl would say that Rodney completely changed. He became incredibly creepy and was saying things like, "I always get the girl." And then at some point, he says, "Hey, you should come out with me tonight. It'll be a date you'll never forget." And she turns to him and just says, "No thanks." This would turn out to be a really wise decision because Rodney was a horrible, horrible person. Had the show done a background check on Rodney, they would have discovered that he assaulted an 8-year-old and went to jail for 3 years for it and was currently on parole. But even if they had done a background check on Rodney, the check would not have discovered what he did at night. Rodney was shamelessly cocky and self-confident, and unlike a lot of men, he had no issue walking right up to any woman anywhere and flirting with her. And he used that to his advantage. He would go up to women in bars and he would convince them that he was a fashion photographer and that they were so beautiful, would you come back to my apartment and do a photo shoot with me? And just like Cheryl on the dating show, these women were immediately kind of charmed by him and would say yes. Once they got back to his apartment, he would shut and lock the door and then become that creepy guy that Cheryl saw backstage. But unlike Cheryl, who at the time she saw this just said, "I'm not interested," and was able to leave, these women were trapped. And then whether they wanted to or not, they would do a photo shoot with him and then he would strangle them to death. Because Rodney Alcala was not your typical dating game contestant. He was a serial killer who, by the time he stepped foot on that show and was chosen by Cheryl Bradford to win the game, he had already killed 4 people. And over a 2-year period, he killed as many as 130 people, which, if you're doing the math, is over those 2 years, he was killing at least 1 person a week. Alcala was finally apprehended and he was sentenced to death.
Our next story is called Something Scratching. On the afternoon of June 1st, 2018, 36-year-old Luis Garcia headed into Mexico City to meet up with his older brother. The two of them were very close. They had been through a lot together. When Luis was 14 years old and his older brother was 15, their parents had gone through a really messy divorce, and during it, their father had just walked out on them and they never saw him again. And shortly after that, their mother remarried and her new husband moved in with the family, and shortly after that, their mother just vanished. And the boys, they asked their stepfather, like, where is she? Where's she gone? But the stepdad would say, I don't know, she went out on an errand and she never came back. And the boys, they were very suspicious of their stepfather because this did not feel like something their mom would do, like she would not abandon them. But just a couple of days after their mom disappeared, their stepfather disappeared too. And so all of a sudden, these teenage boys are just left to fend for themselves. Now, the boys would contact police, and specifically they said, like, hey, we think something happened to our mom. We think maybe our stepdad had something to do with it, but everybody's abandoned us. And the police would launch an investigation, and they would go looking for their mother, but they couldn't find her. And they couldn't find the stepfather or the biological father. And so after the police wound down their investigation, the two boys, again, they've been orphaned now, and they, learned to fend for themselves, but they never stopped looking for their mom. For nearly 2 decades, they continued to search Mexico City for their mother, and they just could never get any sort of closure. They really didn't know what happened to her. And so today, the two brothers had met up, not to go looking for their mom, but instead to meet at their childhood home. So after their mother and stepfather and their biological father had abandoned them, the two boys had lived in the childhood home on their own, fending for themselves. They had grown up there. And then eventually, when they were old enough, they had moved out and started their own adult lives on their own, but they had never sold the house. They had just kind of kept it in their possession and let it sit there. But now they were going back to, go through and sort of clean it up and, decide if they wanted to do some renovations and just kind of fix the place up, maybe to sell it. They didn't know. And so the two brothers, they met up at the home, they go inside and, there's still photos on the wall, old family photos. And there's, all these memories that come rushing back, many of which are very sad and troubling. But, like the brothers, they're having a good time, just kind of going down memory lane. And at some point they decide, okay, you know what? Not only are we going to clean this place out, but also there's some basic renovations that really need to happen here. Like the place has been sitting here for years. It's sort of fallen into disrepair. Let's fix this place up. And so over the next couple of days, they would call in some contractors to begin to do some basic renovations in the house while the brothers continued to clean it up and pack things up and sort of get it ready for whatever it was going to be. And on one particular day, when a group of contractors were working in the master bedroom, the brothers were in the living room doing their own thing when they heard a big commotion coming from the master suite. One of the contractors began yelling for the brothers to get in here and look at what he had found. And so the two brothers, they got up, they bolt into the master suite, and they look at something that was just sitting on the ground. And at first, they didn't even know what they were looking at. But then the contractor, after composing himself, told them what it was. And suddenly, the boys understood what had happened to their mother. It would turn out the brothers were right.
their mother had not simply gone out and abandoned her sons. Instead, on the day their mother left and never came back again, somehow or another, she was bound and gagged and stuffed inside the wall of their family home. And we know this because when that contractor 2 decades later was doing renovations for the brothers inside that home, his sledgehammer went into the wall in the master suite, and when he pulled it out again, a white object came tumbling out of the wall. And that object was their mother's skull. And after pulling apart the wall and looking inside, they would find the rest of her skeleton clearly bound and gagged. And then perhaps most disturbingly of all is that in the wall, they would also find all these scratch marks, suggesting she was alive when she was put in there, which means she was in there desperately trying to get the attention of her sons to save her, but nobody could hear her. Following this horrific discovery, the 2 brothers went to police in Mexico City and told them what happened. And the police would come to the house, they would look all over the place and try to figure out, what happened to their mother, who killed her. But they couldn't solve it. Now, the police always did suspect that the stepfather very likely had some level of involvement here, just given the fact that he himself went missing a couple of days after the mother did. But they could never locate him, and very likely they never will, because today he'd be well over 90 years old and is very likely already dead.
The next and final story of today's episode is called Be Still Their Hearts. On May 27, 2022, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Chad Marsden stood inside of an operating room with a nurse, a surgeon, and their unconscious patient. Dr. Marsden worked at the Baylor Scott & White Surgicare Center in Dallas, Texas, and it was his job to make sure patients stayed asleep during surgery and then woke up safely afterward. That day, Dr. Marsden and his colleagues were wrapping up a routine liposuction procedure on a middle-aged woman. The surgeon had just finished stitching up the woman's incisions, and so Dr. Marsden, following protocol, began taking her slowly off of anesthesia to wake her back up again. And so Dr. Marsden turned off the anesthesia machine, which is this big rectangular device that takes the liquid anesthesia drugs and converts it into a vapor so it can be breathed in, and then Dr. Marsden removed the breathing mask from the woman's face. Then he changed her IV from an anesthetic drug mixture to regular saline. And so now that these drugs were not being pumped into her system, she would wake up over the next half hour or so. After that, Dr. Marsden and the nurse and the surgeon took their patient on the stretcher, and they pushed her out of the OR into the hallway and began making their way down towards the recovery room. But as they were walking down this hallway, they bumped into more of their colleagues, another nurse and another anesthesiologist, and the hallway was tight enough that Dr. Marsden had to step aside to let these two pass. And then after they did, and they sort of waved at their colleagues, Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon continued walking, and as they did, Marsden happened to look down at their patient, and immediately he knew something was wrong. This woman's skin had turned completely gray. Dr. Marsden was totally caught off guard by this. He looked at her vital sign monitor and saw that her blood pressure, which just moments ago had been normal, was now dangerously high. And then as he's staring at her monitor, her blood pressure plummeted. And then also her oxygen levels fell, and then she began foaming at the mouth. It was clear this woman was going into cardiac arrest, which meant if they didn't act quickly, her heart was going to stop. Now, Dr. Marsden, again, is sort of in shock at how quickly this is happening, but he just jumped into protocol. He began giving the woman chest compressions to make sure blood was flowing to her heart. Meanwhile, the surgeon administered oxygen and blood pressure medication, and the nurse called for an ambulance. The reason she had to call for an ambulance is because the Surgicare Center was not equipped to handle medical emergencies. It was only for scheduled surgeries. And so if there was a medical emergency, all they could do was just stabilize the patient until paramedics arrived. And that's exactly what Dr. Marsden, the nurse, and the surgeon did. They got this woman stable, and then just a minute later, 2 paramedics came running down the hallway. They took possession of the patient, they put her onto their stretcher, out the door they went, they put her in the back of the ambulance, and they sped off to the local hospital. As Dr. Marsden watched the ambulance disappear down the road, he knew his patient was now in good hands, but he was still very shaken by the whole experience. Because this type of emergency, somebody going into unexplained sudden cardiac arrest following a totally routine surgery, was extremely rare. Meaning, for this to happen even just once over the course of somebody's medical career, to have witnessed something like that, was very rare. But for Dr. Marsden, this was not the first time he had seen this. In fact, literally the day before, a different patient at the Surgicare Center had also gone into sudden, unexplained cardiac arrest following their routine procedure. So, as Dr. Marsden went back inside and began heading upstairs to the hospital administrator's office to tell them about this latest emergency, he kept thinking to himself how crazy it was that he had just witnessed these two unexplained sudden cardiac arrests basically back to back. But Dr. Marsden just thought to himself, hopefully this is just a really bad coincidence. The Surgicare Center's administrator was a woman named Ashley Burks, and when she heard about this second unexplained cardiac arrest, she knew she had to call a staff meeting. And so that evening, she, along with Dr. Marsden and over 24 other medical staff, doctors, nurses, other anesthesiologists, they met in this conference room in the back of the building. And once everybody was assembled, Ashley began by updating everyone on the two patients who had been rushed off to the hospital for their cardiac emergencies, and she said they had stabilized and they'd be okay. But Ashley then said what everybody in the room was thinking, which is sudden unexplained cardiac arrest is so rare, we can't just treat these things like coincidence. Like something specifically must have caused these incidents, and we need to figure out what that thing was. Now, it was possible that the cause or causes behind these incidents were quite simple. Ashley said to the group, the first thing she did was she looked at the two patients' files to see if they had specific drug allergies or medical risk factors that might have been overlooked by staff. But when she looked at their files, neither patient had those risk factors or allergies, so that couldn't have been it. Ashley said she also looked for just a common thread between these two incidents. Like, were the patients doing something similar? Were they in for similar reasons? Were they in the same room? But no, they were in different operating rooms, going through different procedures with different medical teams. And so there was no obvious common thread between the two incidents. So Ashley said to the group that the only reasonable explanation that she could think of, at least at this point, was that perhaps the equipment in the Surgicare Center had malfunctioned. And so what she was going to do, out of an abundance of caution, was just begin testing all of the equipment in the building. And so Ashley told the group that in the meantime, while she was doing that, the rest of the staff should be extra attentive to their patients and also be on the lookout for potential problems with hospital equipment. Ashley watched the medical staff all nod their heads in agreement and begin sort of talking to each other, and then she thanked them all for being there and told them they could leave. 3 weeks later, on the afternoon of June 22nd, Ashley stood outside the OR in the hallway looking through a cabinet that contained surgical drugs. Ashley was still trying to find a connection between those two sudden cardiac arrests. She'd already checked all the Surgicare Center's equipment, from the anesthesia machines to the vital sign monitors to the breathing tubes, and everything was in perfect working condition. And so now, checking these drugs inside of this cabinet was sort of like her last resort. She'd printed out a list of recent drug recalls and was now comparing that list against all of the drugs inside of this cabinet. And so one by one, she was reading a drug and checking the date on it and comparing it with her list to make sure, they were not carrying recalled drugs still. But after going through dozens and dozens of bottles, there was nothing in their cabinet that was on the recall list. So Ashley still just did not have an answer for why those two cardiac emergencies had happened. However, since that staff meeting 3 weeks earlier, the Surgicare Center had not had another cardiac emergency. And so Ashley was thinking to herself, maybe, despite not knowing how this happened, these troubles are in the past. Ashley shut the drug cabinet and walked down the hallway towards the break room to grab her lunch. But the moment she walked inside, she saw a group of her colleagues sitting around a table looking very upset. In fact, some people were visibly crying. And so Ashley walked up to them and said, "Hey, what's going on?" And a nurse told her that one of their colleagues, an anesthesiologist named Dr. Melanie Kaspar, was dead. Apparently, the night before, she had had a heart attack at her home, and her husband had found her and called 911, but unfortunately, by the time paramedics arrived, she was already deceased. Ashley was shocked. She knew Dr. Kaspar, and she knew she was in great shape. She was only in her mid-50s. She did not seem like someone who might just randomly have a heart attack. But Ashley did remember that over the last few days, she had heard that Dr. Kaspar was not feeling well. And so Ashley wondered if maybe, her heart attack had something to do with that. Either way, as the Surgicare administrator, it was Ashley's job to plan staff events like memorial services. And so Ashley told the group, hey, I'll get to work putting together a small ceremony for Dr. Kaspar. 5 days later, on June 27th, Ashley was sitting in front of her office computer ordering supplies for Dr. Kaspar's memorial when suddenly she heard these loud, fast footsteps out in the hall as if somebody was sprinting towards her office. And then a moment later, Ashley saw her door burst open and the anesthesiologist, Dr. Chad Marsden, was standing there, and he looked absolutely horrified, and he just said to her, "It's happening again." Ashley's stomach dropped, and she jumped up and sprinted after Dr. Marsden, and they made their way to the hallway outside of the OR. And when they got there, Ashley immediately heard the sound of that long single beep of somebody's heart monitor flatlining, and she looked over and she saw one of the doors to an operating room was open, and inside she saw a surgeon performing chest compressions on an elderly patient. And even from out in the hall, Ashley could tell this man was unconscious, his skin was gray, and he was foaming at the mouth. It was exactly like the other cardiac emergencies that had happened before, except this time was worse, because that beep, that flatlining beep, meant that this man's heart had actually stopped. And so Ashley just stood there in horror, watching the surgeon perform these chest compressions, knowing that if that didn't work, if they couldn't get this man's heart started again, he was about to die. Just then, Ashley heard the sound of the doors leading into the OR hallway open, and these two paramedics came rushing inside, and right as they passed her and got to the doorway leading into where this man was basically dying, Ashley heard the sound of the flatline beep turn into regular beeping, which meant the surgeon who was doing chest compressions had managed to restart this man's heart. And so Ashley was relieved, but by no means thought they're out of the woods yet. I mean, this man clearly is going through a medical emergency here. But the paramedics got the man off the OR table, they put him on a stretcher, and they wheeled him away. And so once they were gone, Ashley, Dr. Marsden, and the surgeon who'd been doing the chest compressions, they all just looked at each other like, what is going on here? Clearly, there is something causing all these sudden cardiac arrests, but still nobody knew what it was. Ashley just stood there for a moment, feeling absolutely sick to her stomach. If it wasn't the drugs, and if it wasn't the medical equipment that caused these sudden cardiac arrests, then what was it? Well, Ashley was determined to find out. Over the next 2 months, Ashley interviewed and observed every single employee of the Surge Care Center to make sure they really were following their protocol absolutely to a T. And one after another, through her research, she discovered that they all were. They were doing exactly what they were supposed to be doing. So the cardiac arrests could not be chalked up to faulty equipment, recalled drugs, or human error. And yet, the cardiac emergencies kept on happening at the Surge Care Center. There were 3 incidents in July and 4 more incidents in the first 3 weeks of August. And so in total, that made 10 patients at the Surge Care Center who had all gone into sudden unexplained cardiac arrest. Now, none of them had died, but Ashley knew a few of them had been left with permanent heart damage. People were getting seriously injured on her watch, and she felt like, she can't figure out what's going on here, and so it's just a matter of time until somebody does die from one of these cardiac emergencies, and so she was feeling completely overwhelmed and stressed out and desperate. Until August 24th, when 2 things happened in quick succession. First, in the morning of August 24th, Ashley received a phone call from an officer at the Dallas Police Department, and they told her that the autopsy had been completed on Dr. Melanie Kaspar, the anesthesiologist who had died back in June from a heart attack at her home. And this police officer thought that Ashley really needed to know that her heart attack had not been natural. It was actually caused by an overdose of a drug called bupivacaine. So Ashley knew what bupivacaine was. It was a drug that was basically only used in surgical anesthesia. But Ashley had never heard of anybody abusing this drug or overdosing on it because bupivacaine does not make you high like morphine or fentanyl does. It's closer to Novocaine. It's like a numbing agent. And so Ashley told the officer how weird it was, the idea that she had died of an overdose of bupivacaine of all drugs, and the officer agreed with her. But regardless, he thought Ashley should know because he thought it was possible that Dr. Kaspar had gotten the bupivacaine from the Surge Care Center. And so feeling totally confused, Ashley thanked the officer for telling her, then they hung up, and then Ashley walked to the OR hallway to check the drug cabinet where drugs like bupivacaine were stored. But as soon as she entered that hallway, the second thing happened that day. Ashley heard chaos break out inside of an operating room where she knew an 18-year-old boy was undergoing what should have been a routine sinus surgery. And so she watched helplessly as the doors flung open and a nurse came running out into the hall to call an ambulance. And then inside the room, Ashley saw an anesthesiologist performing chest compressions on this boy, and another doctor was administering oxygen and blood pressure medication. It was the same nightmare playing out now for an 11th time. But this time, after the EMTs wheeled this boy away to be driven off to the local hospital, Ashley was so desperate to figure out what was going on here that she just couldn't wait. And so she rounded up a couple of hospital staffers that were nearby, and they went into that operating room, and they checked the medical equipment, they checked the drugs that had been used, they searched the floor for anything that might have had something to do with this. I mean, they even searched the trash can. And in the trash, Ashley found something that the second she saw it, it made her blood run cold. She couldn't believe somebody would do something this awful, or why they would do this. And so she took the thing she found in the trash, and she ran out of the operating room and upstairs to call the police. Minutes later, 2 police officers arrived at the Surgicare Center, and they saw what Ashley had found in the trash. And when they looked at it, they knew they had a very serious situation on their hands. And so right away, they roped off the operating room where this 18-year-old boy had been, and they began looking for evidence inside of there. And then also, they began reviewing the security camera footage from the OR hallway. And as they reviewed this footage, they would find something truly chilling going on in that hallway that totally explained all of the sudden cardiac arrests that had been happening inside the Surgicare Center. This is what they saw on the clearest piece of footage, which was shot 5 days earlier on August 19th. A hospital employee is seen walking down the OR hallway carrying a stack of papers under his arm. He walks past a couple of his colleagues, and he arrives in front of this big metallic device that sort of looks like a refrigerator, and he opens it up, and he reaches inside, and he pulls out a saline IV bag. Now, when he does this, nobody else in the hallway bats an eye, because this is a totally normal thing to do. That metal device was a warming machine where saline IV bags were stored to be used during or after surgeries. At any given point, this warmer would contain a few dozen IV bags, and whenever it got low, certain staff members would restock it. But the police watched this footage over and over again, and they saw this employee who walks up to the warmer was not just carrying a stack of papers. He was also hiding something within those papers, his own saline IV bag. And so before this man takes out an IV bag from the warmer, he takes this hidden one and places it in the warmer as well. So he's basically swapped one for one. And this was absolutely bizarre because it was not his job to be restocking the warmer. He shouldn't have been putting anything inside of the warmer. And so about 30 minutes after this employee has placed his own IV bag inside of the warmer, a nurse comes out of the OR, walks down the hallway, opens up the warmer, takes one of the warmed up IV bags, carries it down the hall, goes back into the OR, and minutes later, her patient goes into cardiac arrest. It would turn out that nurse had inadvertently grabbed the saline bag that the male employee had secretly placed just minutes before. And she didn't know that that saline bag is what caused the cardiac arrest. Nobody knew until days later when Ashley is so desperate to figure out why all these patients are going into cardiac arrest that she began searching through the trash, and she would find an empty IV bag, and she would see very clearly there was a little puncture on it, just big enough for a needle. And so after seeing this security footage, the police analyzed that empty IV bag that Ashley had found in the trash with a puncture on it to see exactly what was in that IV that went into the 18-year-old who also went into cardiac arrest. And inside, they found a combination of 3 drugs that, when combined, are like a biological bomb that will send somebody into cardiac arrest within minutes. They were lidocaine, which is an anesthetic, epinephrine, which is basically pure adrenaline, and crucially, the 3rd drug found was bupivacaine, the anesthetic that Dr. Melanie Kaspar had overdosed on, which caused her to die of a heart attack. And this discovery meant that Dr. Kaspar's death was almost certainly connected to these poisoned IV bags. In the few days before Dr. Kaspar's death, she had been feeling sick and dehydrated. And on the day of her death, she was feeling so unwell at work that, unbeknownst to any of her colleagues, she had taken a saline IV bag from that warmer and brought it home with her to rehydrate herself. But unfortunately, the one that she grabbed was one of the poisoned ones. When paramedics arrived at Dr. Kaspar's home, they found her still with the IV needle in her arm. But at the time, nobody connected her death with all of the cardiac emergencies at the Surgicare Center. Well, nobody except for the employee who was actually poisoning the IV bags. That employee was an anesthesiologist, but it was not Dr. Chad Marsden. It was the person that Dr. Marsden had to get out of the way for in the hallway that first time his patient had gone into cardiac arrest. The man who was doing the tampering was Dr. Reynaldo Ortiz. He was 58 years old, and he had only worked at the Surgicare Center for about a year. And he had flown mostly under the radar there until May 19th of 2022, which was about a week before the sudden, unexplained cardiac arrests had begun at the Surgicare Center. On that day, on May 19th, Dr. Ortiz had allowed one of his patients to stop breathing, nearly killing the patient. And so as a result of that incident, Dr. Ortiz had been placed under internal investigation by the Surgicare Center, and he was facing the possibility of losing his medical license because of negligence. So to try to avoid losing his medical license, Dr. Ortiz decided he would just try to make all the other doctors look negligent too, taking the attention off of himself. And so he began sabotaging his colleagues' surgeries by injecting those drugs into their patients' IV bags, knowing it would cause cardiac arrest. Now, none of the patients who went into cardiac arrest at the Surgicare Center died. However, Dr. Kaspar, who took that tampered IV bag home with her, did die. And so ultimately, Dr. Ortiz was responsible for her death. In April of 2024, Dr. Ortiz was found guilty on multiple charges, and he is currently facing a sentence of up to 190 years.
The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify or another app of your choice. Today's podcast will feature 3 stories that remind us the most dangerous threats are oftentimes the ones you can't see. The audio from all 3 of these stories has been pulled from our main YouTube channel and has been remastered for today's episode. The links to the original YouTube videos are in the description. The first story you'll hear is called Underwater Building, and it's about friends who investigate this odd structure in the middle of the ocean. The second story you'll hear is called A Tribe's Feast, and it's about a tribe in Australia that thought they had been blessed by a bounty from God, but it ends up being a curse from hell. And the third and final story you'll hear is called A Stiff Drink, and it's about a lighthouse keeper whose routine night quickly turns into a horrifying nightmare. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload 4 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Fridays. So if that's of interest to you, please steal the Follow Button's phone and completely rearrange the locations of all their apps. Okay, let's get into our first story called Underwater.
On July 12, 2015, 30-year-old Christopher LeCun was out on his boat with his wife, his kids, and his best friend Robert just off the coast of Port St. Lucie in Florida. Throughout the day, anytime Chris or Robert were looking down from the boat and spotted a rock pile, they would throw on their scuba tanks and dive down to attempt to find lobsters. Towards the end of the day, when they were looking down into the water, they saw what they thought was a rock pile at first, but as they kept looking at it, they noticed it had lots of straight lines, indicating it could be an underwater building. Chris and Robert noticed there was a yellow buoy floating on the surface right above where this building was underwater, and they thought they should probably go over and read it, but they decided, it's inconsequential, we can just go down and check it out for ourselves. Now, if they had stopped and gone over and read the buoy first, they would have seen there was a warning on it that was telling people to stay back at least 100 feet from this underwater structure. But Robert and Chris didn't read that warning, so they put on their scuba tanks and they dove down into the water. And after only going down about 10 feet, they noticed there wasn't just one structure underwater. There were actually 3 huge structures. And so Chris and Robert looked at each other and they're totally amazed at what they're looking at. They had been scuba diving together since they were young kids, and they'd spent a lot of time in these waters, but they had never seen these before. And so they were very excited to go down and have a look. When they got down there and they were only a couple feet away from one of these structures, Chris saw that the top of the building was just a square concrete slab, and then on all 4 sides there were big concrete slabs. But at the top of each of the 4 walls of this building were what appeared to be openings. They were almost like windows at the top of the structure. And across the window was mesh all the way around, like a grate, protecting things from going into the window and into the structure. And so Chris and Robert went right up to the mesh and tried to look inside of the structure just to see what was in there. But when they looked, it was just too dark inside and there was no way to tell what was in there. And so Chris is really disheartened because he really wanted to know what was inside of this building. And so he just grabs the mesh itself and just kind of tries to tug it in one direction just to see if it would even move, to maybe create some space so he could look inside. And it very easily slid all the way to the side, revealing an opening big enough for he and Robert to go through. And so the 2 of them look at each other and they just nod because they know they want to go inside and see what's in there. And so Chris went in, followed by Robert, and they found themselves inside of just this big empty space, this 70-foot by 70-foot space where there really was nothing inside of it, except down at the very bottom on one wall was this 16-foot wide opening that was the entrance to a huge tunnel. And from where Chris and Robert were at the top of the inside of the structure, they couldn't see into the tunnel. And so they decided, by looking at each other and nodding once more, that they would just go down and try to look to see if they could see through to the other side of this tunnel. And so Chris goes down first, followed by Robert, and as they start making their way down, they both start to feel a current that's pulling them straight down. And as soon as they felt that, they both intuitively knew that they didn't want to be a part of that, and they started swimming as fast as they could back up towards their exit. Robert, who was a little bit higher than Christopher, was able to escape the pull of this current and got up to the top of the inside of the structure towards the exit. Chris, on the other hand, was not able to escape this current's grasp and was actually pulled backwards into the tunnel where he disappeared. Robert had actually turned around and saw his friend get pulled into that tunnel, but he knew there was nothing he could do, and so he just turned around, swam out of the structure, and up to the boat as fast as he could to call 911. Once Chris had been pulled into this dark tunnel, he began tumbling backwards. He had no control over his body position. The current was just way too strong. And so Chris instinctively grabbed his mouthpiece and anchored it inside of his mouth, and then he grabbed his mask and did his best to keep that on his face. Because as he was tumbling, the current kept trying to pull those things off of him. As Chris tumbled through this pitch black tunnel, he began to realize that more than likely he's going to encounter some very powerful pump that's sucking this water through this pipe in the first place, or some huge turbine that has something to do with pulling the water through this pipe. And in both of those situations, once Chris reaches the end of this tunnel, he's going to get cut up and get killed. And so Chris thought about pulling his mouthpiece out to just end it right then and there to avoid this horribly violent death. But he thought about his family, he thought about his kids, and he just couldn't bring himself to do it. And so he just continued to hold on to his mouthpiece and his mask and just continued to tumble with no control in total darkness, having no clue where he was going. After over 5 minutes of this just nightmare situation for Chris, he suddenly sees a very small flicker of light at the very far end of the tunnel in the direction they're being pulled towards. And all he can think of is, okay, well, whatever that light is, that's the area where I'm gonna get killed. There's gonna be some pump or some turbine right out there. And so he's bracing himself for this terrible, violent end to his life. But as they got closer and closer and that light continued to grow, Chris got a better picture every time he would tumble around. He'd get a look, and it did not look like there were spinning blades of death or some pump in there. It actually looked like very peaceful, calm water with sunlight pushing through it. And sure enough, after he got shot out into this lit up area, the current kind of died down and stopped. Chris immediately began swimming right up towards the surface where there was actually land right in front of him. He was inside of what looked like this huge building, and he saw there were people walking around with hard hats. And so Chris just pulled himself out of the water and began yelling for help. It would turn out Chris had been pulled into a nuclear power plant's cooling system. This particular nuclear power plant used a multi-level system where instead of just pulling the water in directly into the plant where it would be cooled and there would be, a pump of death or spinning turbines or something like that, instead there was a reservoir first where the water was dumped, and then after a while that reservoir water would then get churned up into the cooling system. So Chris was just incredibly lucky that that was just the way this nuclear power plant was built, because many other nuclear power plants, if he had done what he did, he would have been killed in a really horrible way. Chris would ultimately sue the power plant, saying they didn't put up enough warning signs or enough deterrents to protect people from getting sucked into these intake pipes, and the power plant has countered by saying, "We put up enough deterrents, you just went past them on purpose." As of now, it's unclear what came of that court case. Our next story is called A Tribe's Feast. On the afternoon of September 27th, 1956, a 13-year-old boy named Neary Morgan was walking with his two younger brothers through a desert in South Australia called Maralinga. Neary and his brothers were members of an isolated Aboriginal tribe called the Martu, and they were out right now to hunt kangaroos for their family. So Neary had a spear, and his two younger brothers had a club, and they also had a boomerang. And for a while, they had been tracking this particular group of kangaroos. But every time they slowed down and, the brothers got ready to strike, the kangaroos would take off, and it was very frustrating. But eventually, as they were walking, this group of kangaroos stopped at a watering hole, which was just a few dozen yards away from them. And so at that point, the brothers knew this was their chance. These kangaroos were going to stay here long enough that they could strike. And so Neary signaled to his brothers that it was time to move. And so they got down in the brush and began advancing on the kangaroos. But after only taking a few steps, they heard this loud rumbling sound off in the distance. And as they looked to see what was going on, the sky suddenly was illuminated impossibly bright to the point where Neary is shielding his eyes to just see what's going on here. And as he was doing this extremely hot gust of wind came blasting through and literally knocked the brothers onto the ground, totally disorienting them. And then from the ground, at some point, Neary kind of turns his head and he happens to look in the direction of the watering hole where the kangaroos were. Then he sees them literally floating in the air, coming right over to him and then dropping on the ground. And then a moment later, it was like everything just went back to normal. The sky went back to a normal color. There was no more rumbling. There was no more wind. Except now, you have all these kangaroos just dead right in front of Neary and his brothers. Now, of course, Neary and his brothers had a lot to process here. I mean, they really had no idea what had happened. But they're looking at this bounty right in front of them, all these kangaroos, and they're thinking, what's just happened here was a gift from God. Clearly, what we just experienced was literally God lifting these kangaroos up, ending their lives, and putting them at our feet. This was a gift. And so eventually, Neary and his brothers, after kind of standing up and dusting themselves off, began lifting up these kangaroos and carrying as many as they could back to their tribe. And then that night, the tribe had this big celebration honoring this gift they had been given from God, and they had this big feast and they ate all this kangaroo meat. I mean, it was incredible. But then the next day, when the tribe woke up, everybody who had eaten any of that kangaroo was violently sick. Vomiting, rashes all over their body, aches, pain. I mean, people were really sick. And over the next few days, some people did recover, but a lot of others did not. And soon, people from this tribe began dying. And so naturally, Neary and the other members of the tribe did make the connection that very likely whatever was happening here, the sickness, was tied to consuming that kangaroo meat. And then other members of the tribe who didn't necessarily subscribe to the idea that, this had been a gift from God, just said clearly the meat was poisoned. But they didn't know if that was intentional, if somebody had done that, or if it was just kind of a byproduct of something else, but poison, that's what was doing this. But for Neary and his tribe, this whole event remained a mystery until 1967, so 11 years later, when Neary was 24 years old. That's when representatives of the British government came out to southern Australia near where the Martu tribe lived and began trying to clean up the mess that they had made. It would turn out all those dead kangaroos that got kind of dumped out of the sky right in front of Neary and his brothers were not the result of, God giving them a gift. Instead, the reason that happened was because of a big scientific experiment that was conducted in Maralinga in total secrecy.
The British government was testing nuclear bombs. Neary and his brothers had been a few kilometers away from a detonation site, and where they were positioned was basically exactly in the right spot to where they would feel the effects of the explosion, they would hear it, they would see this huge lighting up of the sky, they would feel the shockwave, but they were just far enough away from the detonation site that the shockwave and the blast and all that did not kill them. It knocked them to the ground and made them totally disoriented and confused, and I'm sure it hurt a great deal, but it didn't kill them. However, those kangaroos they had been stalking were technically closer to the detonation site. They were also smaller and so were more susceptible to an explosion being affected by it. And so they were just close enough that when that shockwave passed through, it lifted up and obliterated the kangaroos and threw them right in front of Neary. They were like right at that perfect separation point. Neary and brothers just barely safe, kangaroos just barely in the lethal zone. And so keep in mind that Neary and his brothers did not know things like nuclear bombs existed. They're very isolated. They're completely cut off from sort of modern society. And so even though they saw a lot of indications that this was a bomb, they didn't really interpret it that way. Instead, they interpreted this as, oh, God has bestowed upon me this bounty. Like this is a gift from God. But in reality, it was just this explosion, and the meat, the kangaroo meat, was not only devastated from the blast, but it was also littered with radiation from the blast. And so the members of the tribe who ate the kangaroo meat immediately got radiation sickness and began to die. An unknown number of people died from these nuclear bomb tests, and it would take 11 years before the British government would come in and begin cleaning up the nuclear waste. The Australian government ultimately paid $13.5 million in compensation to Aboriginal tribes that were affected by these tests. As for Neary, he survived, and today he's actually in his 80s, and he continues to tell his story to younger generations. The next and final story of today's episode is called A Stiff Drink. At 2 a.m. on December 2nd, 1755, a 94-year-old man named Henry Hall slowly climbed a flight of stairs inside of a lighthouse that was located on this tiny island off the southwest coast of England. Even though Henry was in his 90s, he was still working as a lighthouse keeper out at this lighthouse. By the way, that is a very rugged job, especially in the late 1700s. I mean, if there's ever any emergency of any kind out on this island, there's virtually no communication back and forth to the mainland, and help can't really get out to you very easily. So you're kind of on your own. I mean, lighthouse keepers at the time were sort of viewed as these very rugged, sort of survivalist types. And here's Henry, at 94 years old, still doing this job. But it was because he loved it. And in fact, even to this day, he remains on record the oldest active lighthouse keeper ever. On this particular night, the other two lighthouse keepers that were staying on this island with Henry and working with him, they were passed out drunk in their beds. They basically had drank the whole night away, and they were out for the count. But, Henry sort of expected this. It was his job that night to do the night shift, the worst shift, if you will, where all night, every 30 minutes, he had to, 1, stay sober, and 2, hike his way up to the very top of the lighthouse and make sure the lighthouse was still emitting light. And so that's what he was doing right now. He was heading up to the so-called lantern room at the very top of the spire, the actual lighthouse. And you got to remember that this is in 1755, so this is before electricity. And so the light that was coming out of this lighthouse were literally a whole bunch of candles that were situated in this big chandelier that kind of hung down from the very top of the spire. And then above, where the candles are all resting in the chandelier, was this big dome that was the very top of the lighthouse. And the dome was lined with lead, and there was also lots of windows all around. And so the lead sort of reflected all the light and pushed all the light out all the windows. And so basically Henry's job, or any of these lighthouse keepers, when it was their turn to do this, they had to go up to the lantern room and make sure all the candles were lit. And if they weren't lit, relight them. That was basically it. Now, Henry had been checking on lighthouses for decades. Doing these every 30-minute checks of the candles was completely routine. And so Henry's making his way up, thinking nothing of it. Like, this is going to be completely mundane. I'm going to go up, check the lights, come back down. I'll do it again in 30 minutes, all night. That's all it's going to be. Doesn't expect anything to happen. But on this night, at around 2 a.m., as he's making his way up the stairs, as he's right near the top of the stairs and he's about to turn the corner and see, this big chandelier, it's called a candelabra. And right as he's turning the corner, he starts to smell smoke. And then when he turns the corner, he's looking out at this, completely lit up chandelier, the candelabra, and he doesn't see where the smoke is coming from until he looks up at the lead dome that sort of sat right above all the candles and reflected the light. And this lead dome had been here for a long time. This was an old lighthouse, and he could see there was all this buildup of soot on the underside of this lead dome from the candles being so close to it. And clearly some of the soot that was caked on the underside of this dome was starting to smolder. It was not on fire yet, but it was starting to smolder and some smoke was filling up the lantern room. And so for whatever reason, Henry decided the best thing for him to do was to open up a window, because all the windows were shut at this point and he's thinking, get the smoke out. So he opens up a window, but when he does, it creates a vacuum effect and all this air gets pulled into the lantern room, and oxygen, it sort of acts as an oxidizing agent for fire. It basically accelerates fire. And so oxygen is pulled up and the dome just ignites into flames. Basically, Henry threw a lit match onto the dome. That's the equivalent of what he did. And so suddenly, Henry's staring at this wall of fire on the roof of this lighthouse, and also above the lead dome, the actual structure itself of the lighthouse was wood. And so Henry has no idea what to do. He knows this is obviously a massive emergency. And so as quick as he can, he turns and goes down the stairs, down into the bunk room where his two colleagues are, who are passed out drunk in their beds. And he's trying to shake them awake and tell them we have this huge fire, but they're so drunk that they don't wake up. And so Henry's on his own. He needs to do something about this. And so he gives up on his colleagues and he starts walking back up the stairs towards this fire, and he starts making his way up the stairs. But before he reaches the lantern room, right before, maybe 5-6 feet down below, still on the stairs, there was this outcropping, like a balcony that jutted outside of the actual lighthouse. And so he stepped out onto this balcony, and standing out here, now he's outside, he turned and could look up, and basically right in front of him is the roof, and it's on fire. It's like right in front of him. And out on this balcony were all these buckets that were out there to collect rainwater, because it rained a lot out here. And so there's all these buckets of water, and Henry decides all he can do is start lobbing this water up onto the roof to hopefully put this fire out. And so one by one, he's hauling these buckets of water and chucking the water up on the roof, and it's really not making a difference. And he's so tired and exhausted, and the heat from the flames is so intense. Like, he knows he's not making much of a difference here. But just then he hears his two colleagues come bounding up the stairs, and they're totally panicked. And even though they're drunk, it's clear they're kind of sobering up when they see the scene here. And so they instinctively run out on the balcony with Henry, and all three of them are now grabbing buckets, and they're looking up and they're chucking the water up onto the roof. And Henry at one point sort of positioned himself a little bit closer to the edge and was like right underneath the dome, throwing water up, and it didn't matter. It was like nothing they did could get this fire to go out. And then finally, Henry grabbed one last bucket, and with the last of his energy, he got right below the dome, sort of with his arms out in the balcony, and he looked up and he chucked the water right onto the roof. And as he did, he suddenly felt this blinding pain come over his whole body, but somehow it sort of felt localized in his stomach, but definitely it was his whole body. And he turned and he looked over at his colleagues, like in shock, like he can't even believe, like, what's causing this pain? And his colleagues, they look at him and they see he's smoldering. There's smoke coming off of him. And so clearly he's on fire. And so they start taking their buckets and they're dousing Henry with water. And Henry's like, oh my God, I'm on fire. And he feels this horrible pain in his stomach. And finally, he just blurts out to them, we gotta get out of here. Like, leave it, we gotta go. And so the three of them, they abandon the buckets, abandon the fire, and they bolt out of the lighthouse, and they make their way to a cave on the coast of this island. And there they stayed in this cave overnight as their lighthouse burned to the ground. And all night, Henry, even though now, the fire that had begun on his clothes, it had obviously been put out, but he still had this awful pain that really felt localized in his stomach. It was like this burning, awful pain. And he just couldn't figure out, like, what is that? Is it from being on fire? Was I not aware of how long I was on fire for? Is this just like the result of an extreme burn? Is this smoke inhalation? Like, he didn't know, but he was just happy to be alive. And finally, the sun came up the next morning, and these three men are huddled in this cave. And luckily, there was a ship on the horizon that spotted this smoldering ruin of the lighthouse. And they came in, they scooped the three men up, and they brought them back to mainland England. Once they arrived in England, Henry's two younger co-workers made sure to help get Henry to his home. And then when he was there, they called for a doctor, because Henry was still complaining about this really intense feeling in his stomach, and just obviously the fire had really taken a toll on him. And so the doctor shows up and they perform an examination on Henry, and they see that, yes, you do have significant burns on your body. Clearly you were at one point on fire. And, to Henry, he couldn't quite believe it because, his memory of the night was just, throwing water up on the roof and being so frustrated, like he didn't even realize it, that at some point he'd been on fire. It was just all of a sudden, he had this sudden blinding pain, and before long, he had been doused with water, and that was it. But he still just had this awful pain in his stomach. And the doctor told him, look, I don't know exactly what that pain is from, but very likely when you were on fire / when you were right near the fire, you were inhaling a lot of smoke. And that can absolutely cause a really intense burning sensation in your lungs. And so just apply this ointment to your burns, take care of your burns, and eventually your burns will heal, and that feeling in your gut, like in your core from the smoke inhalation, will pass. And so for the next several days, Henry did as the doctor ordered. He applied his ointment to all of his burns, he rested and just drank lots of water and just basically waited for all these pains and ailments to go away. But over the coming days, he didn't get better. He got worse. Not only would that pain in his stomach just not go away, but also he developed a really bad fever, and then finally, 12 days after the fire, Henry died. Now, on one hand, Henry's death was really not shocking. He was 94 years old. People die when they're in their mid-90s. It's sort of a natural thing. But at the same time, he was like a really active, rugged guy. And it just seemed like, how is it possible he's died from what appears to be sort of relatively superficial injuries here? He definitely got burned. He had real burns on his body, and he had clearly some smoke inhalation going on. But the doctor said, that shouldn't have been enough to kill him. He should have, weathered this and been okay. Maybe he did die from natural causes, but this just feels wrong. Like something else must have happened here. And so ultimately, the doctor decided to perform an autopsy on Henry. And at first, when the doctor began the autopsy, everything kind of checked out, that Henry did appear to, have just passed away, and, he's 94, it is what it is. Until he cut open Henry's stomach. When he saw what was in there, he was horrified. It would turn out, during the fire, when Henry was out on the balcony lobbing buckets of water onto the roof to try to put the fire out, well, at some point, right before he felt that burning sensation in his gut, he looked up as he was throwing the water and his mouth was open, and at the same time he did that, a piece of molten lead from the dome that was on fire dripped down and fell into his mouth, and he swallowed it. A 4-inch piece of molten lead landed in his gut, destroyed his stomach, and then cooled and hardened in his stomach. That was the pain he was feeling. And then he also caught on fire about at the same time. And so in the chaos of the moment, despite this blinding pain he's feeling in his stomach, everybody else is looking at him saying, oh my gosh, you're on fire. That's what the problem is. They douse him with water. And even after he's had the flames extinguished and he's complaining of this pain in his stomach, no one's thinking it can be anything other than the fact you were just recently on fire. That's got to be it. Smoke inhalation, connected to your burns, whatever it is. No one's thinking it could be anything else. Today, that same piece of lead is actually on display at the National Museum of Scotland. Curious Stories is hosted and executive produced by me, MrBallen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone, research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, and Camille Callahan. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio, Jordan Stidham, and Cole Lacasio. Production coordination by Samantha Collins. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song called Something Wicked by Ross Bugden. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. And just a reminder, every new and exclusive episode we put out on the MrBallen podcast, you can also now watch on the MrBallen YouTube channel that very same day. And trust me, some of these stories you truly have to see to believe. Again, my YouTube channel is just called MrBallen. If you want to listen to episodes 1 week early and ad-free, you can subscribe to SiriusXM Podcast Plus on Apple Podcasts or visit SiriusXM.com/Podcast Plus to listen with Spotify. On the night of October 20th, 2021, 2 young couples were hanging out inside of a little home in the woods in Henderson County, North Carolina. The couples were Rachel and her fiancé Chris and their friends Autumn and Jake, whose home it was. Rachel and Autumn were in the kitchen preparing to dye Rachel's hair over the sink. Jake and Chris were in the living room discussing the very strange sightings of a black panther that had been reported all over town in recent days. So, North Carolina does have big cats, including panthers. After all, their professional football team is named the Carolina Panthers. However, the panthers in North Carolina are typically of the brownish color, not the pitch black variety like the panther that was apparently prowling all over Henderson County in recent days. Nonetheless, Chris was absolutely convinced that he had seen this black panther about a week ago when he was out walking his and Rachel's new puppy. He swore the panther had been following him in the tree line around his property, and he had been afraid it was thinking about attacking his dog. Ever since, he told Jake he'd been nervous walking around his property outside, and so he'd begun to carry a gun for protection. Jake was in the middle of telling Chris that he too was now carrying a gun around for the same reason when they were interrupted by Rachel calling for Chris from the kitchen. Jake and Chris got up off the couch and walked into the kitchen, where Rachel told them that she'd been trying to show Autumn a YouTube video about how to dye hair at home when her phone had died. And so she asked Chris if he wouldn't mind going back to their apartment and getting her a phone charger. Now, obviously, Chris was not thrilled about going into the woods at night, with this panther roaming around, but he loved his fiancée and would do anything for her, and he had his gun, so he said he would go. And as Chris headed to the door to leave, Jake said, "Hold on a minute." He grabbed his flashlight and grabbed his gun and told Chris he would tag along and watch his buddies back. The two guys said they'd be back in a minute, and then they walked out the door. A light wind rustled the leaves of the trees as Jake and Chris set out on the little path that connected their two homes. They both stayed absolutely quiet as they walked because they wanted to make sure they could hear any indication of this panther being nearby. But all they could hear was the wind, some crickets, and an owl hooting in the distance. But about halfway down the path, Chris suddenly heard something coming from the woods and instinctively shot out his hand to stop Jake in his tracks. They both froze, and then Jake raised his flashlight and shined it at the underbrush where Chris was saying he had heard noise. And for a second, all they saw were green leaves. But then, two eyes opened up and reflected back at them. The two men gasped and instinctively reached for their guns, but before they had to draw and do anything, this creature emerged from the underbrush, and it was just a raccoon. Chris and Jake laughed in relief and then continued walking down the path to Chris's house. They went inside, got Rachel's charger, and then they left and stepped back into the woods. But now, as Chris and Jake walked along this dark path, something just felt different. The crickets seemed to have gotten quieter and the wind had picked up. The owl that had been hooting before must have flown away because it was now strangely quiet, except for the sound of their footsteps and the wind in the trees. They were about 40 feet away from Jake's house when they suddenly heard a twig snap to their left. And so the two men turned to face the noise, and as they did, they heard another sound, a low, raspy growl. And so Jake aimed his flashlight at the bush where these noises had come from, and this time it was obvious it was not a raccoon, because the bushes were literally shaking like some enormous animal was inside of them. And so the two men looked at each other with wide eyes, and without saying a word, they both knew they were thinking the same thing. It's the panther. And so the two men drew their guns and they aimed it at the bush, hoping that this thing would just take off back into the woods, but it didn't. The bush continued to shake like whatever it was gonna leap out. And so the men just opened fire, and they kept on shooting until they heard a new horrible sound. And the second they heard it, they dropped their guns. It would turn out that was not a panther. After Chris and Jake had left the house, Rachel and Autumn decided to pull a prank. They had found some expired eggs in the fridge, and they had decided they would go hide in the bushes near that pathway and pelt the guys with them. When Rachel saw Chris and Jake approaching, she tried to crouch down lower in the bush so as not to be seen, but as she did, she stepped on a twig. And at the same time, in anticipation of their prank, the women started to laugh. They tried to stifle their laughter, but that only made them snort and shake the bushes. And that combination of noises, the snapped twig, the stifled laughter, which sort of resembled a short raspy growl, and the shaking bushes, signaled to the guys that this was no prank. This was the panther, and if they didn't act, it might attack them. And so they drew their guns, and they began to shoot, until they heard Autumn scream out in horror. Tragically, by the time they had stopped shooting, it was already too late for Rachel. She had been shot to death. Law enforcement did an investigation into the shooting, and they declared it was just a horrible accident. Everybody was sober, and the two men were carrying their weapons legally. And so no one was ever charged with Rachel's death. And to this day, no one has ever gotten solid evidence that that Black Panther even exists. Our next story is called Call Your Mother.
On the morning of September 15th, 2016, an 80-year-old widow named Rita Wolfenson shuffled her way into her kitchen inside of her brick home in Brooklyn, New York. However, Rita was basically blind, and as she made her way into the kitchen, she walked past her table and her foot caught a basket of newspapers in the ground, and it caused her to stumble and fall to the floor. And the second she hit the ground, she heard a pop. And the second she heard that pop, she felt a shooting pain in her hip, and she knew right away, very likely her hip was broken. Now, of course, this is a huge problem if you break your hip, but for Rita in particular, this was a very, very serious problem. I mean, this was potentially life and death, and she knew it, and she also knew the reason this was so serious was all her fault. Rita lived completely alone and basically had cut off everybody in her life. For like 20 years, she had not interacted with virtually anybody in her life, by choice. And basically the reason for this all started 20 years earlier with her beloved son, Louis, who lived with her. But for some reason, 20 years ago, so basically right at the time when she cut off her whole family and all her friends, her son Louis just kind of inexplicably packed up and left her house without saying anything, and then she never heard from him again. And so suddenly losing her son for reasons unknown sent Rita into this spiraling depression, and the way she coped with it was basically cutting off the entire world around her, and she just lived in this house, totally isolated, totally alone. And so now here she is, stuck on the kitchen floor with a broken hip, unable to get up or call for help, and nobody is going to come by to help her. Nobody even knows she's in trouble, she's all alone. But despite basically being blind and knowing she's in this horrible situation, somewhere deep down, Rita finds this inner strength. She knows that if she's going to survive this, she has to save herself. And so she kind of rolled over onto her other side, despite the pain in her hip throbbing the whole time. She got herself onto her elbows, and she began low-crawling her way towards the coffee table in the living room that was right near the kitchen. And she finally got over there. The whole time she's got this horrible pain on her side. She gets to the table, she reaches up, and she grabs her phone, which she basically never used because she didn't talk to anybody or take any phone calls, but she managed to get the receiver off the cradle, and she dialed 911. And so a few minutes later, the ambulance arrives at Rita's house. They come in, they find Rita, she's still on the ground. They scoop her up, they put her in the ambulance, and they go to the hospital. And when they get there, very quickly, they put Rita through a bunch of scans and tests, and they confirm, what Rita was already expecting, which is, her hip is broken. However, after telling her about the fact that her hip was broken, the nurses and doctors told Rita that, you're going to have to stay here for surgery, but then after you get out of surgery, you can't just go home. You're legally blind, you're very frail, and you don't live with anyone, and you nearly died from falling on your kitchen floor because had you not been able to reach your phone, you would have starved to death. And so they told Rita that what she would need to do is move into an assisted living home where basically nurses and a medical team would be able to care for her on a day-to-day basis. Basically, she wasn't going to be allowed to move back into her beloved home where she'd spent her whole life. And for Rita, this news was just unbelievably devastating. I mean, not only because that was her home, that's where she spent all her time, but also because it was the last place she had been before Louis had left inexplicably. I mean, 20 years later, she's still dealing with the trauma of losing her son. And that house was kind of like the last memory of her son. I mean, his bedroom had basically been untouched since he left because she was so holding on to his memory. And so after the nurses and doctors left, Rita was left in the room all alone, kind of unsure what to do, and it dawned on her she would need to do something that for 20 years she had completely avoided doing. She would need to call her family. So she grabbed the phone, and she still remembered the number of her younger brother, Joseph, and so she called Joseph up. Now, the reason she called Joseph is, over the past 20 years, the one family member who had basically tried really hard to stay in touch with Rita after she cut everybody off was Joseph. And so she figured if there was anybody in her family who would not judge her for the silence and, being cut off, it would be Joseph. And so a couple of seconds later, a phone rang inside of a house pretty far away from the hospital, but still in New York. And this was Joseph's house, and he was sitting on the couch reading a book, and his wife was in the kitchen doing her thing. And Joseph, he answers the phone, and when he hears Rita's voice, he couldn't believe it. He was shocked to hear her after so many years, but immediately the feeling he had was relief. He and his sister, before, Louis had left and kind of destroyed Rita's life, Joseph and his older sister had been very close. And it had really broken his heart when Rita had cut him off. I mean, he felt like if there was one person that Rita would have stayed in touch with, it would have been him. But he didn't judge her. He was ready to hear whatever she had to say because obviously something big had to have happened for her to call him. And so he asked her, what's going on? What's going on? And Rita would explain, she fell and she needs help. And Joseph was like, I will be there as soon as I possibly can. And also I'll have my wife swing by your house to grab, your toothbrush and some toiletries and a couple of things from home to make your stay at the hospital a bit better. But we're going to get through this. I'll be there as soon as I can. A few hours later, as Joseph was making his way to the hospital to see Rita, Joseph's wife was on her way to Rita's house to pick up her things. And so she pulled up in front of the house and she looked up at the big brick house and it looked the same as it had, 10, 20 years ago. She made her way up to the door. She didn't knock because she knew nobody was home. And so she used the key that Joseph gave her. She unlocked the door. She opened it up and immediately she was hit with this horrible smell. So Rita was basically a hoarder, and so she had lots of, plates of food and all this stuff just kind of jammed inside of her house, and it was all rotting, and so her house really smelled horrible. Not to mention, Rita basically never went outside. Remember, she kind of was a hermit for the past 20 years. And so Joseph's wife was kind of bracing for a pretty disgusting living situation, but this was far more repulsive than even she had braced for. But she knew she had a job to do, get in there and get some things for Rita. And so she kind of began breathing through her mouth only to avoid the smell. And so she stepped into the house, which again, was piled high on either side of the hallway with newspapers and just kind of junk. And so she began walking through the house and she eventually turned toward a flight of stairs. She went up to the second floor, and the second floor is the same as the first floor. There's plates of food and junk and all this stuff. And she didn't know which bedroom was Rita's. So she just went to the first door that she saw, and she opened it up, kind of hoping that maybe this would be Rita's bedroom. But the second she opened up that door, not only was she hit with more horrible smells, but she saw something in this room that she was not braced for, something that terrified her to the point where she shut the door, turned around, and sprinted out of the house practically screaming, and then as soon as she was outside, she dialed 911. It would turn out Rita's understanding of what actually transpired 20 years earlier with Louis inexplicably leaving, the event that basically caused Rita to shut down and cut her whole family off, her understanding of that was totally wrong. Rita had always believed that her son had just kind of stopped loving her or didn't like her anymore or something, like there was some sort of falling out, and that's why he just kind of packed up his stuff and left without even saying goodbye. But that wasn't true. Louis loved his mother. He didn't just randomly abandon her, but 20 years earlier, when Louis was 29 years old, while he was still living with Rita in her house, he died somewhat unexpectedly from natural causes. It's believed he had some sort of terminal illness that he may or may not have known about, and it's unclear if he even communicated that he was sick or that he had this illness to his mom. And so 20 years earlier, he went into his bedroom one night and he passed away in his bed. And his mother, Rita, instead of going into his bedroom and checking on him, just didn't go into his bedroom and instead convinced herself that her son must have abandoned her because he didn't love her anymore, and it sent her into this spiraling depression and she cut off her whole family, when in reality, Louis had never left her house. He was still laying in his bed upstairs all those 20 years. And so when Joseph's wife went into Rita's house and went into that first bedroom she saw on the second floor, what she saw was Louis's skeleton, still wearing a shirt and pants, laying in his bed, obviously deceased, and that's why she went running out of the house and called 911. And so in a very bizarre and morbid way, it was this discovery by Joseph's wife that would ultimately bring Rita back together again with her family.
The next and final story of today's episode is called The Red Ghost. On a spring afternoon in 1883, a young woman named Sarah tidied up her farmhouse in a tiny settlement called Eagle Creek in Arizona. While Sarah cleaned, her sister Elizabeth took a bucket outside to get water from their outdoor spring. So Sarah and Elizabeth actually lived together in this farmhouse along with their respective families. The American West at this time was sparsely populated and dangerous, so it was not uncommon for families to kind of band together like this. Their husbands herded the sheep and worked the land, while Sarah and Elizabeth looked after the house and also took care of their collective 4 kids. And so on this day, as Elizabeth was out getting water, Sarah continued to tidy up the house with one eye on the kids, making sure they were okay, when all of a sudden, the family's dogs, who were leashed up outside, began barking really aggressively. Now for Sarah, this was really alarming, because the dogs typically were pretty docile and didn't make a lot of noise, so clearly something was going on outside. And so Sarah told the kids to stay inside, and she quickly went outside onto the porch to see what the dogs were barking at. And so once Sarah was out on that porch, she immediately surveyed the area out in front of her, and off to her left and off to her right was just rocky scrubland, and then right in front of their house was this big sandy hill that kind of obscured their view off into the distance. And the dogs, who were leashed up right in front of the property out in the front yard, they were all looking right at that hill and barking at it. At first, Sarah couldn't understand what the dogs were even barking at. I mean, she looked around a few more times to see if she was missing anything, but there was nothing happening out here. But then, as Sarah continued to stare at this hill where the dogs were still barking, she suddenly saw this huge creature emerge over the top and begin coming down the hill in her direction. It was this massive four-legged creature with red fur, and its back was all twisted up. And on the back of this creature was this man. Except it was not a normal-looking man. His face was horrible and sunken, and his mouth was in this huge grin. And as she stared at him in total shock and disbelief, she saw he was missing eyes. Now, Sarah was a deeply religious person, and so as she's watching this creature being ridden on by this person come charging towards her, all she could think was, this is the devil. The devil is riding on this red creature, and it's coming to get me and my family. And so instinctively, she just turned, bolted inside the house, barricaded the door with the kitchen table, and then rounded up the 4 kids and sat in the kitchen, huddled over them, praying to God to save them from the devil. But as she was doing this, Sarah suddenly heard this blood-curdling scream come from somewhere outside. And she knew it sounded way too human of a scream to be coming from the devil or the creature it was riding on. And then she remembered her sister was out there getting water. That scream almost certainly came from her sister. But Sarah was so scared, she couldn't move. And she had these 4 kids to look after. And so instead of going out to try to save her sister, she just held the kids closer and continued to pray, hoping her sister would survive. Hours later, Sarah was still inside the barricaded house, clutching the children, praying, and her sister Elizabeth had not made another sound. And she had not come back to the house. So she's been gone for hours at this point. And Sarah feels horrible. All she wants to do is go out there and find her sister, but she just feels like she can't leave her kids, and she knows the devil is out there, so she can't go out there. But just then, she hears footsteps out on the porch, and then she hears the sound of the doorknob turning and then bumping up against the barricade. And Sarah immediately thinks, it's the devil. The devil's come back. And so she screams, and the kids are screaming. But then on the other side of the door, Sarah hears the sound of 2 familiar voices. It was the sound of her and Elizabeth's husbands. They had come back from herding the sheep, and they're calling into her like, hey, what's going on here? Let us in. And so this huge wave of relief came over Sarah. She rushed to the door, she got rid of the barricade, flung it open, and immediately began sobbing and telling these men about what had happened, about the devil, about hearing that scream, which she believed was Elizabeth. And oh, by the way, Elizabeth is still not back yet, no idea what happened to her. And so the 2 husbands are immediately so concerned. They have no idea about the validity of the story, but Elizabeth is gone. They have to go find her. And so the 2 men, they grab their guns and lanterns, and they head off towards the outdoor spring to hopefully find Elizabeth. And so the 2 men, they began making their way down this path towards the spring. And at first they were walking, kind of keeping their composure, but quickly as they're calling out for Elizabeth and not getting a response, they just took off running. And as they turned the corner and they finally saw the spring, they also saw Elizabeth. And she was face down on the ground with blood all around her. She was dead. And so as Elizabeth's husband wept over Elizabeth's body, Sarah's husband rode off into town to get the local coroner to come out and investigate to see what happened to Elizabeth. The only thing that seemed fairly obvious about Elizabeth's death, at least to the 2 husbands, was that Elizabeth looked like she had been trampled to death. There were all these hoof prints all around her when they found her. And so the coroner, he comes out and he looks at the scene, he sees Elizabeth, and he agrees that it looks like she was trampled to death. However, when he examined the hoof prints that were all over the place, they were way too big to be a horse's hoof print. And so the coroner literally said, I can't say she died by being trampled by a horse. This was not a horse. And so the coroner wound up speaking to Sarah, who would tell him all about, how the devil came over the hill on this big 4-legged creature that was all red, and she heard the scream, which must have been Elizabeth, and so the devil has trampled her sister to death. That's what happened. Now, the coroner agreed with Sarah that very likely her sister had been trampled to death by something gigantic. However, he didn't believe the actual details of Sarah's story. He did not believe that the devil killed Elizabeth. And so ultimately, because the coroner just couldn't be sure what actually happened here, he wound up listing Elizabeth's cause of death as just unknown. But the coroner's doubts did not stop the story of the devil from spreading. Before long, basically everybody on the Arizona frontier had heard about the devil and the strange creature he rode, to the point where they were given a nickname. Together, they were called the Red Ghost. Still, most people who heard this story didn't really believe it actually happened. They figured it was kind of a joke or maybe an exaggeration, just sort of lore passed around town. But over the next few years following Elizabeth's death, sightings of the so-called Red Ghost became much more frequent and more strange. Many campers claim to have seen the Red Ghost trotting through the Arizona wilderness. In fact, some of these people claim that in the middle of the night, the Red Ghost would appear and trample on their tents. One cowboy claimed he got close enough to the Red Ghost that he was able to actually lasso its neck. However, the Red Ghost, in turn, took off so quickly and so powerfully that the cowboy got dragged and had to let go. And so stories like these, run-ins with the Red Ghost out in the wild, persisted for years, until about a decade after Elizabeth's death, this farmer in eastern Arizona happened to look out his window, and there, standing in his turnip patch, was the so-called Red Ghost. And this farmer had heard all the stories about the Red Ghost, and he had already made up his mind about what he would do if he ever ran into the Red Ghost, and that would be to shoot it. And so what did he do? He grabbed his rifle, he leaned out the window, and he fired. The Red Ghost crumpled to the ground right in the middle of the turnip patch. Once the creature was down, the farmer rushed outside and ran up to the carcass to finally see what the heck the Red Ghost was, what was causing all these stories to spread over so many years. And when he got out there and actually looked down at the Red Ghost, he knew immediately that all the stories about this creature had been wrong. It would turn out the Red Ghost was not the devil riding some supernatural monster. Instead, the Red Ghost was a combination of two very mortal beings. The first of these two beings was a creature that, if you saw it today, you would know what it was, but for folks in Arizona in the late 1800s, they would have no way of knowing what this creature was. They had never seen it before. It had red fur, a long neck, and a humped back. It was a camel. It had been brought to the United States from the Mediterranean to help haul supplies through the western frontier, and it had escaped captivity. But this camel alone was not responsible for scaring the people of Arizona. What terrified the people of Arizona and created the legend of the Red Ghost was the rider of the camel. When Sarah saw the rider on the camel, at first she thought it was a person. But when she looked more closely, she saw they didn't have eyes and they had this disgusting toothy grin. They just couldn't be human to her. And so she had decided this must be the devil. But it would turn out her first instinct was right. This was a person. There was a person on the back of that camel. The devil on the back of the camel was a man's decomposing corpse. And because he was a decomposing corpse, his flesh and eyes had rotted from his face, making it look like he had no eyes and gave him this huge toothy grin because there was no flesh there. Now, we don't know who this man was or how exactly he died. All we know is at some point he was riding this camel escaped, he died, and somehow didn't fall off, and his dead body remained in an upright seated position on this camel. And then this camel just roamed around Arizona for years with this corpse on its back, giving the impression that it was the devil riding on a monster. Today, the Red Ghost remains a local legend in Arizona. In fact, there's even a permanent statue of the camel in a small Arizona town called Quartzsite.
On the morning of October 20th, 1997, a 40-year-old man named Kevin Dowling rowed a small boat across a reservoir that was near his home in Spring Grove, Pennsylvania. And this reservoir was beautiful. It was quiet and peaceful out here, and the weather was perfectly cool, and the leaves on all the trees around the water were very colorful and starting to fall. And as Kevin looked around at all this incredible scenery, he knew he had chosen the exact right spot for what he needed to do. So Kevin had rented this boat to go fishing. But in reality, he was out here primarily just to have a place where he could relax and just think. So lately, Kevin's life had been incredibly stressful, and so moments of calm and peace were just very few and far between. The stress really began when, recently, Kevin had lost his full-time job. He had been an operations manager at a convenience store, and he had been fired after making just one mistake. And now he had to work the night shift at a Staples store just to support his family. and they were barely getting by. And Kevin, believe it or not, was generally speaking a very overachieving person. And so to have his life playing out the way it was, just very disappointing. And it was also just turning him into a very stressed out, angry person. And he knew that was happening. He'd been lashing out at his wife, yelling at his kids, and he had even gotten into this horrible altercation with an art gallery owner in town. And so finally, after a couple of months of just being this sort of awful person with these angry outbursts and sleepless nights as a result of all this stress, he knew he had to do something to turn things around. And so he thought this fishing trip was just what he needed. Kevin looked towards the front of the boat where there was a camera set up on a tripod. Anytime Kevin went out on these fishing expeditions, he would film himself, both to capture the moments he would catch the fish, and also because he just liked, after he'd returned from these trips, to just watch the footage all over again. It sort of brought him back to a time and place, out on the water that was just great. He liked fishing, it was peaceful, it was calm, and so he was doing that for this trip as well. Even though, right now, as he sat there, as serene as things were, he was filled with a whole lot of angst and a lot of stress and anxiety, but he figured, you know what, I'm out here, I need to put on a good performance for the camera, be the happiest version of myself I can be, so that when I return to dry land and I show this footage to my family and I refer to it myself, I don't want to see that I was so, upset while I was out here. This is supposed to be my catharsis. This is supposed to be a chance for me to decompress. So basically, he looked at the camera and sort of told himself, okay, smile and enjoy this trip. This is good for your mental health. And so Kevin rowed a bit further into the reservoir and he came to a spot that he thought was good. He pulled in the oars and then he reached over and turned on the camera and sort of waved and said, okay, I'm out here about to start. And then he took a deep breath and he cast his line into the water. Early the next morning, Kevin was at his kitchen table feeling extremely tired. So the day before, after he had gone fishing on the reservoir, he had a night shift at Staples. And so he did the whole shift. He comes home, he barely sleeps, and now he's back up again. And so he's just totally exhausted, eating breakfast with his wife. And so while the two of them are just sitting there in silence, eating their food, there's this sudden sharp knocking on the front door. And the two of them look at each other like, who would this be? They both didn't know. And so Kevin got up, he walked to the front door, he opened it up, and he was very surprised to see two police officers standing there. And so Kevin asked them, how can I help you? And they told him they were here because of a fight that Kevin had gotten into with that art gallery owner a few months ago. They said that the entire situation had now escalated and the police needed to get a statement. Now, Kevin did not try to deny that he had gotten into a fight with this person. So instead, he just stepped outside to speak to them alone. And pretty much the instant he was out there speaking to the cops, it was like his stomach was just in knots. I mean, it just seemed crazy that the day before he was out on the beautiful reservoir going fishing, having this sort of nice time. I mean, his life was so stressful these days, but it's like just yesterday, he had finally found some peace. He was so eager to watch back his video of him fishing. That was just a nice moment in time, a rare nice moment. And now he's got more problems, more stress being piled on. He couldn't believe it. But Kevin knew he needed to comply here. Whatever they needed, he was going to try to give it to them. And so he just asked one of the officers to please explain a little bit more about what was really going on here. This seems pretty serious. And one of the officers, he just said, look, I can't give you too many details here. But they told him there had been another altercation at the art gallery yesterday morning. And Kevin was being considered a suspect at this point because he had previously gotten into a fight with this owner. Now, for Kevin, obviously, this was not good. This was very bad. This was shocking. This is not good news. But on the other hand, when they said this happened yesterday morning, I mean, Kevin's mind immediately went to his fishing trip. He had been fishing yesterday morning. He was at this reservoir that's at least 45 minutes away from the art gallery. He had receipts from taking that boat out. He had receipts from his fish bait. He even took a video that was likely time-stamped while he was out in the water. And so Kevin tells the officers that, I have no idea what happened at the art gallery, but I wasn't involved. Whatever happened yesterday, that was not me. A few seconds later, Kevin had led the officers into his house. He had gone upstairs, grabbed his fishing bag out of his closet. He had rifled through it and grabbed all the receipts and then come back downstairs. And when he did, he saw the officers were speaking to his wife and asking her about his alibi. And she had said, yes, Kevin had been fishing. And she'd even watched a home video of his trip that he had made, because he always made videos of when he went fishing. And so at this point, the officers seemed satisfied and they took the receipts as well as the videotape that Kevin's wife had mentioned, and they said they'd just be in touch if they had any more questions. Over the next few days, Kevin totally forgot about the police stuff. I mean, whatever happened at the art gallery, that had nothing to do with him. That was totally separate. He had given the evidence over. He hadn't heard from the police. So in his mind, that's over and done with. However, on the evening of October 29th, so a little more than a week after the police had first shown up at his home, Kevin had just finished making dinner and was about to sit down and eat it with his family when the doorbell rang, followed by a series of very loud knocks. And so Kevin, he got up, sort of looked at his wife. They both exchanged a look like, who is this? And then he walked over to the front, and through the window, he could see who it was. It was the police again. But this time, when he opened the door, they didn't ask politely for him to just make a statement. Instead, one of them immediately stepped forward and slapped a pair of handcuffs on his wrists and said he was under arrest. So the real reason why Kevin's life had been so stressful, that really he couldn't get a night's sleep, that he's just constantly anxious, really didn't have to do with the fact that he had lost his job. That was part of it. But really it was the thing that caused his firing that was keeping him up at night. And that was actually his altercation with the art gallery owner a few months earlier. That altercation was actually really, really serious. It was not just he and this woman getting into a fight. No. Kevin robbed this woman and also assaulted her. And then he was subsequently arrested, lost his job because he was arrested, and then while he was out on bail, he's staring down this trial date that's looming for these charges he's been arrested for, and he knows there's footage of him, there's witness testimony, he's gonna lose. He's got no job, he's gonna look like a total pariah in the community. He's embarrassed, he's made this horrible decision, and his life is already basically wrecked, and it's only gonna get worse if this goes to trial. And so what does he do? Kevin, the perfectionist who always sort of follows through on all the things in his life, to that point, he decides he needs to go back there to the art gallery and finish the job. He needs to get rid of this woman so there won't be a trial, so he won't be found guilty, so his life won't be ruined. And so, about a week ago, he did go back to the art gallery, he killed this woman, and then that same day, he goes out on the reservoir and pretends to be out there on this fishing trip. He films himself fishing because that's what he did always do. But really, it was just in order to create an alibi that would show he was out on the water, even though it was actually in the afternoon. He was not there in the morning. He filmed that video in the afternoon. He claimed it was in the morning. And basically, Kevin almost got away with it between the receipts for the boat and the bait and this video and his wife saying, oh yeah, he was fishing the day before. And Kevin was very innocent when he spoke to police. But what got him caught actually was the video. In the video, the position of the sun, which the officers picked up on, didn't make sense for it being the morning. It was too high in the sky. If it had been the morning, it just would have looked visibly different. And so they determined that Kevin's video was not shot in the morning. He could have filmed that at any point later in the day, which created a window that morning that he could have gone back to the art gallery and he could have killed that woman, which he did. Also, just to add credibility to this theory that Kevin had forged this video, or at least forged the time he had shot it, an expert was able to determine that the timestamps on the video had been tampered with, further clarifying that this was a fake. Kevin was found guilty not only of the robbery and assault charges that he was initially charged with, but also he was found guilty of first-degree murder. He was sentenced to death, and as of April 2026, he is still on death row awaiting execution. Our second and final story today is called The Green Parrot. Just before 6 p.m. on Sunday, July 12th, 1942, a man named Robert stumbled into a bar called the Green Parrot in Harlem, New York. And Robert was already very, very drunk. He'd been drinking all afternoon because he'd won a bunch of money in a dice game earlier that day, and he had just been celebrating. And now he was wandering into this bar, the Green Parrot, to keep the party going and keep on drinking. So at this point in 1942, the neighborhood where he was, Harlem, which is a neighborhood within New York City, it really struggled with a very high level of violent crime. And this bar, the Green Parrot, was very popular amongst locals. And so this bar attracted a big crowd, which often became a very rough crowd. And so because of how violent this area was, and because of all this cash that Robert had won earlier in the day, which he had on his person, Robert had decided to bring his gun with him out to the bar, like he was armed as he walked into the Green Parrot. And he was glad he was, because again, this is like a dangerous spot. But as Robert actually went inside of the Green Parrot, he found that it actually wasn't that crowded that night. Now, it was only about 6 p.m. and it would get much busier, or it usually got much busier later in the night. But at this point, even though he's very drunk, he looked around and he saw there was like maybe 20 people in there. And for Robert, this actually was kind of a good thing, because it meant it would be easier for him to get up to the bar and, get served, get more drinks. And so Robert staggered his way over to the bar where the owner, Max Geller, was pouring drinks and helping customers. And so Robert, he gets up there and he looks around, and right away he actually recognized a number of people that were there at the bar. They were regulars. And then he saw actually there was one particular regular, this shorter guy, who he knew was really mean and nasty and just super aggressive, and he clocked him as a guy that he wanted to keep his distance from. And so Robert turned his attention to Max, the owner, and he sort of sloppily waved at him, trying to get his attention. And Max, who was still busy preparing drinks for others, he sort of looked up and stared at Robert and kind of, did sort of like a check of him to see how drunk he really was. And then Max served the other people, and then he walked over to Robert with sort of a skeptical look on his face, and he's like, "What can I do for you, Robert?" And Robert, he's like closing one eye, he's so drunk, he's like, "Yeah, I want a drink." And Max looked at him and he's like, "No, you're too drunk, I can't serve you." Now, at first, Robert was just defensive and was basically like, "Come on, like I'm in here all the time, and I've certainly been pretty drunk before and you've served me. I don't understand why this is different." But Max stuck to his word and he's like, "No, I'm not going to serve you. You're too intoxicated." And so slowly Robert became angrier and angrier, and he began saying, like, "You're serving everybody else. There's guys here that are more drunk than me. Like, I don't get it. Like, you have to give me a drink." And at this point, Max, sensing just how upset Robert was, he said, "Look, now you're going to just have to leave. Like, I'm not going to serve you, and you have to leave." And Robert, he went from now just being mad to being humiliated. He's being like humiliated in front of the whole bar. And it was almost like he couldn't help what he did next. It was like rage coursed through his body. And almost without thinking, Robert drew his gun, aimed, and fired. And he shot Max in the face. Now, instantly, as soon as this shot rang out, the bar is just thrust into absolute chaos. People are screaming. Like 90% of the people in there had no idea this was even happening, let alone that people are shooting each other. It was just chaos. People are screaming, they're running around. And Robert, it was like he couldn't even believe what he had just done, and he just immediately pocketed and hid his weapon and sort of just backed away from the scene, because again, people aren't even sure who got shot. People are looking around. He sort of began to blend into the crowd, and then as soon as he could, he just turned and ran out of the bar. About a half an hour later, around 6:30 p.m., an investigator with the New York City District Attorney's Office named Louis Panuco hurried down the sidewalk toward the Green Parrot, which at this point was swarming with police officers. Panuco, who had just been called to the scene, really only knew that there had been a shooting at this bar and that the victim had apparently been shot in the face but was alive, and he was on his way to the hospital. Outside the bar, Panuco could see a bunch of these police officers already interviewing a whole crowd of people, who Panuco assumed were witnesses of the shooting. And there were a lot of them. So Panuco hoped that at least one of them would have something useful to say. And so Panuco just let these officers handle this initial questioning of this group. If he needed to, he would speak to people later, but for now, he just headed inside the bar to see what was going on. And as soon as he stepped inside, another officer came up to Panuco to just give him a quick briefing. He said the bar's owner, Max Geller, was the one who had been shot, and he had been shot in the mouth, and that he was alive, but when he was taken off to the hospital, he was unconscious, so nobody could ask him what happened. Then this officer told Panuco that there had been a bunch of customers in the bar during the shooting, and that was the crowd outside. Those were the people that the officers were getting statements from. However, this officer told Panuco that so far, almost none of the people they were speaking with were cooperating. Pretty much everybody was just saying, "Oh, I don't know what happened," or "I didn't see who shot who." It was like they didn't want to tell the police what they actually knew. The only witness so far who had said anything of substance was this very short, very loud regular, who even now, a half an hour after the shooting, was acting extremely agitated and just sort of like loud and very aggressive. It was the same one, the same regular that Robert, when he had first walked in, had noticed and thought, boy, I don't want to be around that person. This regular was just screaming that this whole thing was a robbery. That was like all he kept saying. It was a robbery. It was a robbery. But, I mean, in the eyes of the officers who were around this regular, this short, angry guy, it just sort of seemed like he was traumatized by what he saw. And so he was just repeating the word robber over and over and over again, in part likely because he was drunk, in part maybe because he was traumatized, and it was like a weird response he was having. So it was just sort of heavily discounted what he was saying. They're like, okay, maybe it was a robbery, but maybe you're just kind of out of it. But the officer told Panuco that, they searched the bar, at least they did a cursory search of the bar, and it didn't seem like anything had been taken. So it really didn't seem like this was a robbery. So again, it just seemed like this guy who was yelling about the robbery basically didn't know what he was talking about. And so at this point, Panuco, on the one hand, he was frustrated by what he was hearing, but also he really wasn't that surprised. I mean, he's thinking that, in this area in Harlem at this time, there was a huge distrust of police. I mean, most residents refused to cooperate with authorities. And so it was very likely that some of these people who were out here, not just the guy yelling about a robbery, but the other witnesses, it was very likely that at least one of them knew something. I mean, there wasn't that many of them in the bar at the time of the shooting, but it was just unclear if he would ever get any of that information. But Panuco knew he would obviously still have to try to get some information from these people. So after getting this brief from this officer, and after sort of walking around the inside of the bar for a second, Panuco headed back outside to try to talk to some of the witnesses himself. But pretty much immediately when he began speaking to these people, he saw that there definitely was like a front being put up. He just had this sinking feeling that this investigation was pretty much dead before it was even going to get started. Fast forward about a month, and Panuco is still hard at work working on this case, except the case took a turn, because the victim, Max, he fell into a coma right after the shooting, and for weeks he had been in a coma, and authorities, Panuco included, were hopeful he would wake up and he'd be able to give them additional information about what happened, give them anything, because no one by this point had given them any new information. They had basically no evidence, they had nothing. But unfortunately, Max, without regaining consciousness, just died. And so now this was not just a shooting investigation that Panuco was in charge of. He was in charge of a homicide investigation. A homicide investigation with basically no leads. Because again, it's like none of the witnesses had given them anything. All they knew is Max got shot and now he's dead. And then the only other sort of substantive thing that had come out of any of their interviews was from that short, angry guy, the regular from the bar who had just demanded that this was a robbery. And, at first pass, they had looked around the bar. It didn't seem like anything had been taken, and they had sort of ruled out a robbery. But now, a month later, they had really looked into that angle, and they had confirmed that nothing had been taken from the bar. So this was definitely not a robbery. And so basically, Panuco had nothing. And so at this point, Panuco decided that his best bet here was actually just to basically start over, just to zoom back out and go back to square one and just see if there was something that they missed. And in fact, Panuco had brought in a new detective, a guy named John Morrissey, to help him with this new approach. Morrissey was supposed to be this incredibly smart guy who was known for thinking outside the box, something that Panuco felt like they could really use right now. And so on this particular day, Panuco had sent Morrissey to the Green Parrot to just speak to anybody that was there. Just see if he can learn anything about the shooting from people that are at the bar where this happened, like right now. Just go there and talk to people. So off Morrissey goes, and Panuco, he stayed at the station, and that day he was going to re-interview all of the patrons who had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, just to see if, maybe he could get some additional information out of them. And so far, that was not the case. Basically, all the interviews were dead ends like they had been the first time, and so he had somebody in the room with him right now, and the interview had gone nowhere, and he's like, you know what, you can go. Like, all right, on to the next one. And so that person leaves the interview room, and Panuco, he gets up, and he walks out into the hallway where all these patrons are sitting on chairs waiting to be interviewed. And as he's, getting ready to just grab the next person to speak to, he sees there are two women who were patrons in the bar who were sitting sort of halfway down the hallway, and they were talking to each other. And they were really not being careful about how loud they were speaking. Like, their conversation that they must have thought was private was loud enough that basically everybody in the hallway could hear it. But the reason it really stood out to Pinuco is they weren't speaking English. They were speaking French. Except unbeknownst to these women, who likely believed nobody in this hallway spoke French, Pinuco did speak French. And he could hear these women were talking about the case. They were saying that, hey, when you go in there to speak to this detective, tell him you don't know anything. Like, don't give him any information. Because if we do and we get wrapped up in this case, like, we're going to get dragged out into the public for being involved in this shooting. And what's going to happen is people are going to know that we were at that bar drinking on that night and we told our husbands we weren't. They're going to be so mad at us. Like, we gotta be quiet. Don't tell the detective anything. Just say you know nothing. And so immediately, Pinuco, he walks over to these two women and he points at one of them and says, hey, you're next. Come into the interview room. And he said this in English. And so the women were kind of surprised that they were being tapped to go next, or this woman was surprised. And so she gets up and sort of waves to her friend, and she follows Pinuco into the interview room. And so as soon as they sat down, Pinuco, in English, says to this woman, so are you really worried that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate with me? And the woman was clearly very surprised by this question, but she just sort of feigned like maybe she didn't fully understand because, she'd been speaking French out there. She doesn't know if Pinuco knows that she does or doesn't speak English. And so she just sat there in silence and just looked back at him like she didn't really understand. And Pinuco just stared back at her and then, in perfect French, asked the same question. Like, are you worried, again in French, that your husband is going to find out you were at the Green Parrot if you cooperate? And at this point, the woman knew, like, the jig was up. Clearly, this detective overheard the conversation they had in the hall. That's why he's pulled me in here. I'm caught red-handed. And the woman just began to break down and cry. And then after a few moments, without Pinuco even needing to push her to do this, she just started telling the whole story. She explained that her and her friend out in the hallway had been at the Green Parrot on the night of the shooting, and they actually did see who shot Max. She said it was this guy who was wearing a black and white checkered suit. He had gone up to the bar, and then some sort of altercation happened, and he pulled out a gun, and he shot Max, and then he quickly ran out of the bar. Now, she told Pinuco that she didn't know this guy's name, but she definitely recognized him. She said that, she had been to the Green Parrot before the night of the shooting, and she had seen this guy, and she thinks that he's just like a regular at this bar. Like, she would definitely recognize him again if she saw him. And so Pinuco, at this point, he could barely contain his excitement. This was really like the first meaningful lead in the whole case. You have a suspect who apparently is a regular at the bar where the shooting took place, and he dresses in a really distinct way. He wears, flashy clothing. Like, this is a great lead. And so Pinuco, like, he's thrilled. He thanks this woman. He goes out and he grabs the other woman and he brings her in for questioning. And she would echo the same story as the first woman, that yes, they had been there. They had seen this guy. He was a regular, they thought. And he wore these flashy clothes. And so after this, Pinuco is like, I got to tell Detective Morrissey. I got to fill him in on what I've just learned. This totally changes the case. And so he ran over to Morrissey's office to see if he was back yet from the Green Parrot. But when he went in there, he saw that he wasn't. And so Pinuco, he's like, all right, I'll go back to my office and I'll start making a plan for what we're going to do next until Morrissey gets back, and then I'll brief him up then. And so Pinuco, he goes to his office. He starts excitedly making, plans of what they're going to do. And then a moment later, his door bursts open and Morrissey comes flying into the room, and he looks totally out of breath, like he's rushed to be here to tell Pinuco something. But Pinuco, he turns, and even though he sees, like, clearly Morrissey's got something to tell me, he doesn't let Morrissey talk because Pinuco, he's got this big news about the French women. And he just starts telling Morrissey all about this crazy revelation and how he caught them speaking French and they were there. And we have this suspect now. He tells him everything he knows. And so Morrissey, even though he had something big to say himself, he's sitting there listening to Pinuco go on. And at the end of it, he's like, man, that is amazing. That's awesome. Great lead. But I'll do you one better. I know the killer's name. It would turn out when police first arrived at the Green Parrot after the shooting, like on day one of this investigation, what they found was basically nothing. They have a victim and they have a bunch of witnesses, but none of the witnesses would cooperate. Like, there was no leads, no information, no real evidence. All they had was basically this one short, loud, angry guy who kept talking about a robbery. but they had sort of looked around the bar and it didn't appear like this was a robbery, and so he had been discounted. And everyone's like, well, he's traumatized. He's sort of like this angry guy who's sort of a mess. We're not going to take him seriously. What he's saying doesn't really add up, so he was kind of discounted. But it would turn out they actually just misunderstood this guy. He wasn't saying robbery, but they didn't know that at the time. They thought he was. They ruled him out. Fast forward a month, and Mr. Think Outside the Box detective, Morrissey, he goes back to the Green Parrot to see what he can learn. And so Morrissey, he's hearing this, and he was told this is what this short guy was saying the first time too. Like, this is not that surprising. But Morrissey, he thought outside the box, and he figured out what this witness actually meant. The key to doing this was really understanding exactly who this witness was and what the witness was actually capable of knowing. Because this witness, this short angry guy, was actually a literal green parrot that the bar was named after. The parrot was the owner, Max's, pet, and he was always there in the bar. He was a regular, sitting on his perch. And the bird was a huge tourist draw because he was kind of really aggressive and could be sort of mean, and people thought it was pretty funny. And critically, this parrot had been trained to recognize the bar's regulars and refer to them by name. So when Morrissey went back to the bar and listened to the parrot again, he eventually realized the bird was not saying robber, robbery, and trying to describe like what had happened. No, instead, the bird was saying Robert, the name of the person responsible, the regular, who he had seen commit this crime. And wouldn't you know it, between this new information and what Penuco had learned from the two French women at the police station, they put their information together and they discovered that there really had been a regular at the Green Parrot bar, a guy named Robert Butler, who was a 28-year-old cab driver who had fled to Baltimore right after the shooting. The detectives were able to track Robert down and confront him about the murder, and when they explained how they'd figured it all out, Robert just had one thing to say: "I never did like that bird." Robert Butler was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 15 years in prison. The Green Parrot bar eventually closed, and as for the actual Green Parrot, nobody knows what happened to him. The MrBallen podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, is hosted and executive produced by me, Mr. Ballen. Our head of writing is Evan Allen, produced by Jeremy Bone and Cole Acasio. This episode was written by Kate Murdoch and Kate Gallagher. Story editing by Evan Allen and by Luke Baratz. Research and fact-checking by Shelley Shue, Samantha Van Hoos, Evan Beamer, Abigail Shumway, Camille Callahan, Alex Paul, Ben Fasciano. Research and fact-checking supervision by Stephen Ear. Audio editing and post-produced by Whit Lacasio and Jordan Stidham. Production support by Antonio Manata and Delana Corley. Artwork by Jessica Clogston-Kiner. Theme song, Something Wicked, by Ross Bugden.